Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. We're not just talking about history, we're traveling back to the very dawn of a civilization so resilient, so brilliantly organized, that it makes the rest of the ancient world look like a series of failed startups. For 3,000 years, through droughts, invasions, and civil wars, Egypt endured. And it all started not with a pharaoh or a pyramid, but with a river. So get comfortable, hit that subscribe button, and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. For me, it's just past dusk, and the shadows are getting long. Perfect for a story this old. The ancient world had four great river civilizations. Mesopotamia rose along the unpredictable, violent Tigris and Euphrates. China emerged on the flood-prone Yellow River. The Indus Valley civilization developed beside its namesake. But only one of them lasted for 3,000 continuous years: Egypt on the Nile. So what was their secret? What made ancient Egypt so remarkably resilient? How did it outlast nearly every other civilization of the ancient world? Tonight, we're charting the entire epic saga of ancient Egypt, from the first farmers who settled beside the Nile's fertile banks, to Cleopatra's faithful and ultimately fatal alliance with Rome. This isn't just about pyramids and mummies, though we'll get to plenty of those. It's about understanding how a civilization maintained its core identity, its very soul, through floods, famines, invasions, and occupations for over 30 centuries. It's a story of human ingenuity on a scale we can barely comprehend. Long before the Grand Pyramids cast their shadows across the desert, or pharaohs claimed divine right to rule, prehistoric Egypt was taking its first tentative steps. The story begins not in a dusty wasteland, but around 10,000 BCE, when the harsh North African climate was actually wetter, greener, more hospitable. Imagine savannas teeming with life. Early inhabitants lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers, moving seasonally to follow game and gather wild plants. They were survivors, reading the land like a book. These early Egyptians left behind tantalizing clues to their existence, stone tools scattered across ancient lakebeds that are now just mirages and rock shelters, decorated with images of giraffes and elephants, wildlife now extinct in the region. It was a different world, but the world was changing. As the climate gradually became drier, around 7,000 BCE, the Green Sahara began to vanish, and these nomadic groups were pushed inevitably toward one constant source of life: the Nile River. This slow, relentless migration marked one of humanity's most significant transitions from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture. It was a choice between adaptation and extinction. They chose to adapt. And what a place to adapt to. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was a miracle. Early farmers cultivated barley and emmer wheat, domesticated cattle and goats, and established the first permanent villages along the river's lush banks. Think about that moment. For generations, your entire existence has been movement, uncertainty. Then you discover this strip of unimaginable fertility, and you stop. You build a home that you know you will see next year. That psychological shift is everything. The Nile itself shaped every aspect of this new settled life. Unlike other ancient river civilizations that faced unpredictable, violent flooding, looking at you. Mesopotamia, the Nile's annual inundation occurred with the regularity of a Swiss watch. Each summer, fed by rains far to the south, the river would gently rise, spilling over its banks and depositing mineral-rich silt across the floodplain. This wasn't a disaster. It was an annual renewal. This natural fertilization created exceptionally fertile soil, a thick black mud that supported abundant crops year after year. The breathtaking predictability of this cycle gave early Egyptians something rare in the ancient world: a profound sense of cosmic order. This belief That the universe itself was rational and dependable would later manifest in their religious and philosophical concepts, becoming the bedrock of their entire society. You can see this early sophistication in their view of the world beyond. These weren't simple farmers. At Nabta Playa in southern Egypt, Stone Age people constructed one of the world's oldest astronomical observatories, around 5000 BCE stone circles that tracked solstices and equinoxes. They were already mapping the heavens, demonstrating an early understanding of celestial movements that would become central to later Egyptian religious thought. As settlements grew more permanent, so did their culture. Distinctive pottery traditions emerged, with the black-topped red ware of Upper Egypt becoming a signature style. Craftspeople worked with increasingly diverse materials: bone, ivory, semi-precious stones, and eventually copper. The earliest Egyptian figurines reveal a growing artistic tradition. Representations of animals, fertility figures, and eventually human forms becoming more sophisticated over time. And with permanence came politics. Evidence of social hierarchy appeared as communities grew larger and more complex. By 4500 BCE, the egalitarian dream of early villages was fading. Certain graves contained noticeably more elaborate goods than others: fine pottery, jewelry, stone vessels. This suggests the emergence of elite groups, chieftains, or big men, who commanded greater resources and respect. These social distinctions would eventually lead to the chiefdoms and proto-kingdoms of the late prehistoric period. And these people weren't isolated. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive trade networks reaching into the Levant, Nubia, and even the distant Red Sea coast. Copper from Sinai, gold from Nubia, and shells from the Mediterranean all found their way into these early Egyptian communities. This demonstrates sophisticated exchange networks, a web of connections and diplomacy thousands of years before formal international diplomacy existed. They were already players on a world stage. By 4000 BCE, the Nile was no longer a unified cultural zone. Distinct regional cultures had emerged. In the north, the Mahdi culture developed close connections with the Levant. But in the south, the Badarian and later Naqada cultures were creating something more aggressive, more complex. The Naqada culture, named after its type site near modern Luxor, would eventually expand northward, its influence spreading like a cultural tide, laying the groundwork for Egypt's eventual unification. In the final centuries of the prehistoric era, the stakes were raised. Competing centers of power emerged. Archaeological sites like Hierakonpolis reveal the existence of walled towns with monumental buildings, craft workshops, and evidence of specialized labor. At Abydos, elaborate tombs suggest powerful rulers commanding substantial resources, people who were already thinking in terms of dynasty and legacy. These proto-states, each controlling sections of the Nile Valley, were the immediate predecessors to the unified Egyptian state. The stage was set. The Nile Valley was a simmering pot of rival kingdoms, each with its own gods, its own rulers, and its own ambition. From these fragmented proto-states was about to emerge perhaps the most consequential political event of the ancient world, a unification so profound that its symbols would still adorn royal regalia 3,000 years later. Part 2. The First King and the Birth of a Nation. The air along the Nile, around 3100 BCE, was thick with more than just humidity. It was charged with the ambition of petty kings. The once unified vision of a cosmic order was now mirrored by a fractured political reality. In the north, the kingdom of Lower Egypt, with its red crown and papyrus symbol. In the south, the kingdom of Upper Egypt, its rulers adorned with the stark white crown and the lotus. They were two different worlds, two different visions for the future, separated by culture and the relentless flow of the river. They were on a collision course. And from the southern heat haze emerged a ruler, whose name would echo for millennia Narmer, around 3100 BCE, as bronze tools were spreading throughout Mesopotamia, and Stonehenge's earliest structures were being built far to the north. King Narmer accomplished what had previously seemed impossible. This ruler from Upper Egypt, the southern region, launched a military campaign northward. This wasn't a mere border skirmish. It was a campaign of conquest, a deliberate and brutal forging of the world's first territorial nation-state under a single authority. Imagine the scene, the clatter of weapons on the riverbanks, the war cries echoing off the water, the sheer, audacious scale of the ambition. He successfully conquered Lower Egypt in the north, and in doing so, he didn't just win a battle. He invented an idea, the idea of Egypt. The story of this momentous unification survives not in a dry chronicle, but through one of the most electrifying artifacts ever discovered, the Narmer palette. This isn't just a ceremonial cosmetic slab carved from siltstone. It's the world's first political propaganda, a Stone Age press release. This remarkable artifact tells a visual story across its two sides in stunning, violent detail. On one side, Narmer, enormous and imposing, wears the white crown of Upper Egypt. He holds a mace high, ready to smash the skull of a helpless, kneeling enemy. Before him, the decapitated bodies of his foes lie with their heads between their legs. It's a brutal declaration of victory, but flip it over and the narrative deepens. Here, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt. He is no longer just the conqueror from the south. He is now the ruler of the north, striking down a foe who represents chaos itself. He is preceded by standard bearers, and below his feet, two tangled serpent-like beasts, perhaps symbolizing the two lands, are being restrained, brought under control. The palette doesn't just commemorate a military victory. It establishes an entire visual language of kingship that would persist unchanged in its essentials throughout Egyptian history. This was the first example of a ruler using art to craft his own legend to say, "This is not just what I did, this is who I am." The political genius of Narmer's unification wasn't simply in the conquest, but in the brilliant theatrical way he legitimized his rule. Rather than merely subjugating Lower Egypt as a conquered territory, he positioned himself as the rightful ruler of both regions, creating a dual identity that became the foundational myth for all Egyptian kingship. He didn't destroy the North's identity. He absorbed it, creating a powerful new whole. This innovation in political theology gave birth to the concept of the king as both earthly ruler and divine mediator, establishing the framework for what would later evolve into the pharaonic institution. And he needed a capital to match this grand new vision. Building upon its historical centrality, the Nile's geographic midpoint became a natural choice. Here, he founded a new settlement initially called White Walls, which we know as Memphis. Its location was pure political theater, symbolizing the perfect political and cultural convergence of Egypt's two regions. It was a statement in mud, brick, and stone. This is the heart of the new united body. Archaeological evidence suggests Narmer likely founded the settlement, with later kings expanding it into the administrative and religious center that would serve as Egypt's capital for 8 centuries. This was the nerve center of the state. The visual symbolism of this dual kingdom extended to the very body of the king. The most iconic symbol became the double crown, the pshent. This wasn't just a fancy hat. It was a physical combination of the white crown of Upper Egypt with the red crown of Lower Egypt. When worn together, these previously competing symbols created a powerful walking metaphor for the newly unified state. Every time the king appeared, he was the union. Similarly, the royal titulary began incorporating dual elements. The sedge plant, symbolizing Upper Egypt, and the bee representing Lower Egypt became standard elements in royal names, a constant linguistic reminder of the two lands now woven into one tapestry. Interestingly, despite our modern association of ancient Egyptian rulers with the title pharaoh, this term wouldn't enter regular usage until over 1,000 years after unification. During Narmer's time, the ruler was known by titles that hammered home this new dual identity, like he of the two ladies, referencing the protective goddesses of North and South, or dual king, emphasizing his role as ruler of previously separate lands. The word pharaoh itself derived from the Egyptian term for great house, per-aa, and originally referred to the royal palace rather than the king himself. It was like calling the White House, and having that term eventually mean the president himself. The man was becoming inseparable from the institution, but beyond these symbolic changes, unification catalyzed an explosion of practical innovations necessary for governing a vast territory. You can't run a nation on symbolism alone. The need to administer a unified state, to count things, to tax things, to command things, accelerated the development of hieroglyphic writing from simple labels into a complex tool. Some of the earliest known examples of this script date to this period, born from bureaucracy. Standardized measurement systems, centralized tax collection, and organized religious practices all emerged as practical solutions to the challenges of ruling the newly expanded kingdom. Even pottery styles and artistic conventions that had previously varied by region began to homogenize, creating a cohesive cultural identity from Nubia to the Mediterranean. This transformation from competing regional powers to a unified state represents one of history's most successful and enduring examples of nation building. Unlike many ancient conquests that quickly dissolved after a ruler's death, like a sandcastle against the tide, Narmer's unification created a state structure and an idea of Egypt so resilient that it would maintain its essential identity for 3 millennia, despite periods of fragmentation and foreign rule. He built a foundation that could weather any storm. Part 3. Divine Kings and Human Sacrifice, the Early Dynastic Period. Narmer's successors inherited more than just a unified territory. They inherited the monumental, terrifying task of inventing an entire system of governance from scratch. As the dust of unification settled, Egypt entered what scholars now call the Early Dynastic Period, circa 3100 to 2686 BCE, encompassing the First and Second Dynasties. These pioneering rulers had to transform Narmer's military achievement into something far more enduring, a functioning civilization with distinctive cultural, religious, and administrative practices. They had to build the machine of state, and some of the gears they used were horrifying. Memphis solidified its role as the administrative heart of this new nation. Strategically positioned at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt, it was more than a capital. It was a living symbol, a perpetual enactment of the Union. Here in bustling government offices, buzzing with scribes, the blueprint for millennia of bureaucracy was being drawn up. Building on earlier innovations, writing systems became more refined under these early dynastic kings, evolving from a more symbolic use into a precise practical tool for state governance. Royal names now appeared enclosed in rectangular frames called serics, a stylized palace facade topped by the Horus falcon. These were the forerunners of the cartouches that would later become synonymous with Egyptian royalty, a literal encircling of the king's name for protection. These early hieroglyphics, scratched onto labels and jar ceilings, reveal a rapidly evolving system designed primarily for practical governance: inventory lists, tax records, royal decrees, rather than lofty literary expression. This was the unglamorous paperwork of empire, and it was absolutely vital. But if the administrative innovations speak of cold, calculating order, the religious practices of this era reveal a society grappling with terrifying cosmic questions. The evolution of royal burial practices during this period offers perhaps the most striking and disturbing window into early dynastic society. At Abydos, the sacred burial ground of these early kings, archaeologists have uncovered massive tomb complexes that are more than just graves. They are statements of absolute power, even in death. These tombs were surrounded by rows of smaller subsidiary burials. Initial excavations revealed something chilling. These weren't the graves of loyal servants who died of natural causes. These subsidiary graves contained the bodies of court officials, servants, and craftspeople who had been sacrificed, ritually executed to accompany their king into the afterlife. It was the ultimate perquisite of power, taking your entire staff with you. The scale is staggering. The royal tomb of King Jer contained the remains of nearly 600 sacrificed retainers. Imagine the scene, a line of courtiers, each stepping into their own prepared grave, believing or being forced to believe that their service to the God King extended beyond death itself. This practice of retainer sacrifice, which would be utterly abandoned by later Egyptian civilizations, demonstrates how the emerging raw concept of divine kingship justified extreme brutal measures during this experimental phase. The king's journey to eternity required a retinue, and the state's power to provide one was absolute and terrifying. It was a dark corporate restructuring for the afterlife. To manage their expanding territory in the land of the living early dynastic kings, implemented a system of breathtaking efficiency that would become a hallmark of Egyptian resilience. They divided Egypt into administrative regions called nomes, each overseen by a provincial governor, or nomarch. This nome system created Egypt's first formal bureaucratic structure, allowing for effective taxation and resource management across the newly unified land. A nomarch in the Delta could be ordered to send grain to a mining expedition in the Sinai, and the system ensured it happened. Remarkably, this provincial framework would endure for thousands of years, a testament to how fundamentally sound these earliest administrative experiments proved to be. They built a chassis so strong it could carry the nation for millennia. This period also saw the beginnings of a religious ideology that would later portray the king as both a divine presence in life and a figure united with the gods after death. The king was the embodiment of Horus the falcon god, the rightful ruler of the living world. Architecture heralded these future developments. The traditional mud brick mastaba tombs, rectangular structures with sloping sides covering underground burial chambers, grew increasingly elaborate like cakes with more and more layers. Some royal tombs began incorporating stone elements, lintels, flooring, paving, pre-caging the revolutionary all-stone monuments that would define the next era. These early experiments with stone construction represented a significant technological leap, requiring new quarrying skills, new transportation methods, and new organizational capabilities. They were learning to cheat erosion to build for eternity. The period wasn't without conflict. Evidence suggests tensions between competing power centers, particularly during the Second Dynasty, when inscriptions hint at religious conflicts concerning the gods, Horus and Seth, a struggle between order and chaos that mirrored political instability. The final Second Dynasty, King Khasekhemwy, appears to have reunified Egypt after some form of internal strife. His very name meaning the two powers appear, and his unprecedented use of both the Horus and Seth symbols in his royal titulary suggests a powerful compromise, a reconciliation of the two opposing forces that had torn at the state. He was the peacemaker who ended Egypt's first civil war. Artistically, early dynastic craftsmen were busy establishing the visual rules that would define Egyptian aesthetics for thousands of years. They codified the distinctive profile view of human figures, eyes and shoulders, front-on head, and legs, in profile hierarchical scaling to indicate importance. The king is always the largest figure, and the use of a grid system for proportional representation. Early masterpieces, like the ivory figure of King Den, smiting an enemy, already display a breathtaking sophistication and a confident artistic language that would characterize Egyptian artistic production forever. They weren't just making art. They were creating a visual grammar for power order and divinity. The stage was now set. The state was organized. Its bureaucracy was humming. Its artistic style was defined, and its religion was codifying around the figure of a divine king. The foundations were laid deep and strong. But a foundation is not a pyramid. The relatively modest kingdom of the early dynastic period was about to be shattered and reborn as something unprecedented, a society capable of architectural achievements that would remain unrivaled for millennia. The age of the pyramid builders was dawning. Part 4. The Stone Revolution. Imhotep and the Step Pyramid. The story of how Egypt became one of history's greatest civilizations enters a transformative chapter with Dynasty 3. Around 2686 BCE, as King Djoser ascended the throne, Egypt stood at the precipice of an extraordinary evolution. The kingdom of the early dynastic period was functional, yes, but it was about to become something else entirely. It was about to become eternal. This shift wasn't born from a massive army or a new weapon. It was born from the mind of one man, a genius polymath named Imhotep. And it would change the landscape of human achievement forever. King Djoser's ambition changed the course of human history when he commissioned his brilliant vizier Imhotep to create his eternal resting place. The brief was simple, yet impossible: build something that lasts forever. The tradition was to build a mastaba tomb, a flat-roofed rectangular structure made of mud brick. But mud brick melts in the rain and crumbles over centuries. It was a material for the temporary, for a kingdom still finding its feet. Imhotep looked at these traditions and saw only limitations, so he broke from them completely. His design would become the Step Pyramid complex at Saqqara. It was a revolutionary leap in both scale and material, an audacious gamble using a new technology stone, not just as an accent, but as the very fabric of the entire structure. Rising 204 feet high with 6 distinct tiers, this massive structure required approximately 850,000 tons of limestone. It was humanity's first monumental stone building. Think about that for a second. Before the Great Pyramid, before the Parthenon, before Stonehenge was even finished, Imhotep was figuring out how to quarry, transport, and stack multi-ton blocks of stone with breathtaking precision. He was inventing structural engineering on the fly. The psychological impact of this achievement cannot be overstated. Before Djoser, royal tombs, while impressive, remained fundamentally impermanent, built from materials that would eventually erode back into the earth from which they came. The Step Pyramid proclaimed something entirely new, something almost arrogant, that the king's power transcended time itself. It was a declaration in limestone. As the sun caught the polished white limestone, casing stones that were so finely fitted that the joints were nearly invisible, the entire structure would have appeared to literally glow on the horizon. It wasn't just a tomb. It was a permanent manifestation of royal divinity, a beacon of power, visible for miles across the Nile Valley. For a people whose entire worldview was based on cyclical renewal, this was a shocking statement. Some things are not meant to cycle. Some things are meant to last. But the pyramid itself was just the centerpiece. The complex surrounding it reveals the sophisticated spatial understanding of Imhotep's design. It wasn't a lone monument. It was a corporate campus for the afterlife. Enclosed by a massive wall stretching 640 feet long and 900 feet wide, a defensive barrier against chaos, the ceremonial courtyard contained numerous ritual structures. There was the said festival court, where the king would perform renewal rituals, proving his continued fitness to rule. There were mock palaces, shrines, and chapels. And here's the truly brilliant part. These structures, which would have initially been built in perishable materials like wood and reed for actual festivals, were here translated into permanent stone. Imhotep was freezing a moment in time, petrifying the ephemeral rituals of kingship into eternal stone. He was demonstrating stone's potential, not just for mass, but as a flexible, imitative building material. He made stone look like wooden pillars and rolled up reed mats. It was architectural magic. Imhotep's genius, however, extended far beyond architecture. As Djoser's chief minister and high priest of the creator god Ptah, he embodied the Egyptian ideal of the polymath, the Renaissance man, millennia before the Renaissance. His comprehensive knowledge encompassed medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and theology. He was the state's brain trust. Such was his lasting reputation that centuries after his death, he achieved something almost impossible in rigidly hierarchical Egyptian society: deification without royal blood. By the late period, Egyptians worshipped him as a god of healing and wisdom. Pilgrims would travel to his sanctuary at Saqqara, seeking cures, leaving offerings to the man who had become a god. The architect had outshone the king he served. This era, the Old Kingdom, witnessed the full flowering of the concept of divine kingship that the early dynasts had experimented with so violently. While earlier kings had associated themselves with gods, Old Kingdom pharaohs were now understood to be living manifestations of Horus in life and Osiris after death. This theological framework positioned the king as the essential intermediary, the linchpin that maintained Ma'at, the fundamental harmony of the universe. This cosmic order, often symbolized as a feather or a seated goddess wearing that feather, was more than just truth or justice. It was the fundamental harmony of the universe, the balance that kept chaos at bay. When pharaohs claimed to live by Ma'at, they asserted their role as the guarantors of cosmic stability. The king's proper performance of rituals, maintenance of temples, and defense of Egypt's borders were considered essential to preventing the world from falling back into the void. The weight of existence itself rested on his shoulders. To execute this divine mandate, Old Kingdom rulers developed what may have been the world's first true bureaucracy. A sophisticated administrative system emerged from the rudimentary one of the early dynasts, now with specialized titles and offices that sound like something from a modern corporation. The hierarchy extended from viziers, chief executives, down through overseers, scribes, middle management, and tax collectors. Monuments from this period proudly record titles like Overseer of all the King's Works and Keeper of the Royal Archives, suggesting a complex governmental apparatus employing thousands of administrators across the Nile Valley. This wasn't just government. It was a machine designed to channel the nation's wealth and labor toward a single goal: maintaining the divine order by glorifying its living representative on earth. And that glorification was about to reach a scale that would dwarf everything that came before. Part 5. Cosmic Machines, the zenith of pyramid building. While Imhotep's step pyramid revolutionized Egyptian architecture, what followed would dwarf it in scale and precision so utterly that it still defies belief. How could a civilization without modern tools, without iron, without the wheeled pulley, create structures so perfectly aligned to the stars that they deviate from true north by less than 1/360th of a degree? The answer lies in the 4th dynasty, 2613 to 2494 BCE, when pyramid construction reached its terrifying glorious zenith under the pharaohs Khufu Khafre and Menkaure. Their monumental tombs at Giza represent not just the pinnacle of ancient Egyptian engineering, but the absolute peak of human organizational capacity in the ancient world. This was the corporate headquarters of the afterlife, and everyone in the nation had a job to do. Khufu's Great Pyramid is a numbers game that never ceases to astonish. Initially, standing 146.6 meters tall, it contained approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2.5 and 15 tons. That's enough stone to build a waist-high wall around the entire coast of France. The mathematical precision is staggering. The base forms an almost perfect square, with sides differing by mere centimeters, despite spanning more than 230 meters. The sides are aligned almost perfectly to the 4 cardinal directions. This isn't just construction, it's geometry on a monstrous scale, a testament to a society that had mastered astronomy, mathematics, and logistics in a way that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years. The construction process involved a complex network of specialized workers that goes far beyond what most people imagine. Forget those Hollywood depictions of masses of groaning slaves whipped under the desert sun. That's a myth. These monuments were built by rotating teams of skilled Egyptian laborers, stonemasons, engineers, draftsmen, carpenters, supplemented by seasonal agricultural workers during the annual Nile flood, when farming was impossible and the state could mobilize a huge idle workforce. This was a public works project that doubled as a religious duty. Archaeological excavations at the workers' villages at Giza reveal evidence of a well-fed, cared-for labor force. They received medical care skeletons, show set bones and successful surgeries, and they were organized into competitive teams with playful, boastful names. Graffiti inside the unfinished infrastructure of the pyramids includes monikers like the Friends of Khufu and the Drunkards of Menkaure. This was a national project, and there was pride in the work. The logistical coordination was unprecedented. Special harbors were constructed to receive gleaming white limestone from Tura and massive granite blocks from Aswan, hundreds of kilometers away. Copper tools, the hardest metal they had had, to be constantly resharpened as they wore down against the relentless stone. Food production had to be ramped up to an industrial scale to feed the army of workers. Bakers, brewers, and fishermen worked around the clock. Specialized artisans were needed to create the intricate interior chambers and passages with their complex corbelling and polished granite sarcophagi. The entire enterprise represents history's first large-scale state-organized project, made possible by Egypt's sophisticated and now terrifyingly efficient bureaucracy. This was a machine that converted grain and labor into immortality. Beyond their architectural magnificence, the pyramids served as cosmic machinery in Egyptian religious thought. They weren't just tombs, they were launch pads. The straight, narrow, ascending passages were precisely aligned to specific stars, particularly those in Orion's belt, which Egyptians associated with Osiris, god of the afterlife. The pyramid shape itself represented the Ben-Ben, the primordial mound from which creation emerged, and it symbolized the sun's rays descending to earth, a ramp for the pharaoh's soul to ascend. These structures were designed to rocket the deceased pharaoh directly to his place among the celestial, imperishable gods. They were the world's first space rockets built of stone. Inside Khufu's pyramid, the king's chamber contains peculiar features that still puzzle archaeologists. There are the so-called air shafts that don't actually ventilate the room, but instead point directly toward key stars in the ancient Egyptian sky, a direct line to the cosmos. The sarcophagus in this chamber is made of a single block of granite and is too large to have been brought in through the finished passages. It had to be placed there during construction, evidence of the meticulous advanced planning that governed every aspect of these projects. Every block had a place, every passage had a celestial target, and every ounce of labor was accounted for. The social implications of pyramid building were profound. These massive projects reinforced the pharaoh's godlike power by demonstrating his ability to marshal resources and labor on a scale that must have seemed supernatural. Yet they also fostered a powerful sense of national identity and purpose, uniting thousands of people from different regions in a shared sacred enterprise that transcended local affiliations. The specialized knowledge developed during construction, from advanced astronomy to engineering, from mathematics to project management, created an intellectual legacy that influenced Egyptian civilization for millennia. They were building more than a tomb. They were building a nation's confidence. After the 4th dynasty pyramid building continued, but never again reached the same insane scale or precision. The 5th dynasty pharaohs built smaller pyramids while diverting more resources to sun temples, a shift in religious focus. By the 6th dynasty, the quality declined further as royal power gradually diminished. The Great Age of Pyramids, this unbelievable burst of creative and administrative energy, lasted only a few generations. Yet it represented ancient Egypt at its most powerful and organized a society capable of achievements that would remain unmatched for thousands of years. They had reached for the stars, and for a brief, glorious moment, they had touched them. Part 6. The God King's Burden. The Theology of Power. While the diminishing scale of the pyramids might have seemed like a sign of decline, it masked a profound transformation taking place within the very soul of Egyptian kingship. As the physical monuments became smaller, the concept of divine power expanded exponentially, creating a system where the pharaoh no longer just ruled people. He embodied an entire cosmic order. He became the living bridge between humanity and the gods, the sole anchor preventing the universe from sliding back into chaos. This shift wasn't accidental. It was a calculated, brilliant corporate rebranding, moving from monumental construction projects to the even more powerful business of ideology. The pharaoh now stood at the apex of a sophisticated theological system that presented him as the guarantor of universal harmony. His daily life was a ritual, his every action a cosmic event. Every morning, when the pharaoh awoke, the sun rose not merely by coincidence, but because the king, as the earthly manifestation of the divine, performed the necessary rituals to ensure its continuation. When he officiated ceremonies, he wasn't just leading religious observances, he was literally maintaining the order of creation itself. His heartbeat was the rhythm of the universe. To fail in his duties was to risk plunging the world into eternal darkness. The burden was immense. The physical manifestations of this absolute power became a complex, non-negotiable uniform. The pharaoh was rarely seen without his full regalia, each piece a chapter in a book of divine right. The curved crook represented his role as the shepherd of his people, guiding and protecting his flock. The flail, with its 3 strands, symbolized his authority to punish to maintain order through fear if necessary. And the distinctive Nemes headdress, with its striped blue and gold cloth, framing his face and falling over his shoulders, wasn't just a crown. It was a halo of power, instantly recognizable and utterly intimidating. These weren't simply decorative elements. They were visual theology, a costume designed to transform a mortal man into a recognizable divine figure whose very appearance reinforced his supernatural status. He was walking propaganda. Throughout temple walls across Egypt, a curious and violent motif appeared with remarkable consistency, scenes of the pharaoh arm raised about to smash the skull of a cowering enemy. He holds them by the hair, a gesture of ultimate dominance. What makes these smiting scenes so fascinating is that many were carved during extended periods of peace when no actual military campaigns were underway. These images weren't commemorating past victories. They were magical protection ritual acts frozen in stone. The pharaoh was perpetually defeating the forces of chaos to maintain Ma'at. The enemy figures weren't necessarily historical opponents. They were personifications of disorder itself. Isfet, the eternal enemy that had to be defeated every single day through the power of royal ritual. It was a cosmic battle fought in relief carvings. Of course, running a universe required a capable chief operating officer. The growing complexity of royal authority necessitated the expansion of the administrative apparatus, and the office of the vizier evolved into the most powerful, non-royal position in the kingdom. Often drawn from elite families or shrewdly from the king's own relatives to ensure loyalty, the vizier was the king's right hand. He oversaw justice, taxation, and most crucial government functions. Every morning, the vizier would meet with the pharaoh to discuss affairs of state before carrying the royal will throughout the vast bureaucracy. In the king's absence, the vizier's authority was nearly absolute, making him indispensable to governance. Yet he was always subordinate to the divine kingship. He managed the mundane so the god king could focus on the metaphysical. The economic engine that funded this divine enterprise was the temple system. Massive temple complexes like those dedicated to Ptah at Memphis, or later to Amun at Thebes, weren't simply houses of worship. They were economic powerhouses, the ancient world's equivalent of multinational corporations. They controlled vast agricultural estates, workshops, and labor forces. Records show that by the height of the New Kingdom Temple, domains collectively controlled approximately 1/3 of Egypt's arable land. Each donation the pharaoh made to a temple, whether land cattle or precious materials, was a clever reinvestment. It strengthened both divine and royal authority by creating centers of production and distribution tied directly to pharaonic legitimacy. The king fed the gods, and the gods, through their earthly estates, fed the people, creating a perfect loop of power and patronage. The theological foundation supporting this entire edifice evolved as well. The solar cult of Ra gained unprecedented prominence, with pharaohs increasingly incorporating Son of Ra into their official titulary. This divine sonship wasn't metaphorical in Egyptian theological terms. It was terrifyingly literal. The king was believed to be physically generated by the sun, God's divine essence, which was infused into the queen through supernatural means. Each pharaoh thus became a living manifestation of raw divine power, a solar engine connecting Egypt directly to the cosmic forces that governed life itself. He was less a man and more a necessary breathing component of the universe. This was the pinnacle of the Old Kingdom's ideological achievement, a perfectly balanced, self-justifying system where the pharaoh's divinity was the answer to every question. But what happens when the divine fails? What force could possibly topple a civilization where kings commanded the sun to rise and maintained universal order through their mere existence? The answer lies in a perfect storm that Egyptian theology never prepared them for, a crisis not of men, but of nature. The Nile itself was about to fail, and when your god king controls the river and it stops flowing, the entire cosmic system doesn't just wobble, it shatters. Part 7. The collapse of order, drought, famine, and the first intermediate period. The divine power that flowed through the pharaohs, the rituals that commanded the sun, the bureaucracy that moved mountains, none of it could prevent what came next. A collapse so profound, it challenged the very foundation of Egyptian cosmology. What force could possibly topple a civilization where kings commanded the sun to rise and maintained universal order through their mere existence? The answer lies in a perfect storm that Egyptian theology never prepared them for. It wasn't an invading army. It was the sky. It was the river. The very elements they worshipped turned against them. Around 2200 BCE, climate records from deep within ice cores and lake sediments reveal a severe, prolonged drying trend across Northeast Africa and the Middle East. The rains that fed the Nile's sources in the Ethiopian highlands and the Great Lakes region of Africa failed. Season after season, the eternal lifeline, the one constant in their universe, began behaving unpredictably. The Nile's annual inundation, that reliable bringer of life, was weak. Some years, it was a pathetic trickle that barely reached the fields. The result was agricultural devastation on a cataclysmic scale that the centralized state was utterly powerless to address. These environmental catastrophes struck directly at the heart of pharaonic legitimacy. The entire ideological framework of the state crumbled under the simple, brutal logic of empty stomachs. If the king was truly a living god who controlled the cosmic forces, if his rituals truly maintained Ma'at, then why were the fields barren? Why were the storehouses empty? Why were children starving? The faith that bound the nation together began to unravel thread by painful thread. The God King had failed his most basic test he could not provide. As harvests failed year after year, the carefully constructed administrative apparatus, the pride of the old kingdom, began to crumble from within. Tax revenues calculated based on expected agricultural yield plummeted. Meanwhile, food prices soared, creating a devastating inflationary spiral and a fiscal crisis that bled the monarchy dry. The vast bureaucracy that had once directed the construction of pyramids and managed national resources could no longer be paid or fed. Scribes abandoned their posts. Officials looked after their own families. The machine ground to a halt. More significantly, the ideology of divine kingship suffered a devastating, possibly fatal blow. How could the people trust a living God who couldn't deliver the most basic necessity food? The social contract was broken. Archaeological evidence at provincial cemeteries tells a revealing story of this power shift. The nomarchs, the provincial governors who had once served as mere extensions of royal authority, began styling themselves as independent rulers. Their tomb inscriptions no longer emphasized loyalty to the distant pharaoh in Memphis. Instead, they proudly highlighted their own local achievements and their personal provision for their people. One particularly boastful provincial governor named Anktefi had this carved into his tomb. I gave bread to the hungry and clothing to the naked. I brought life to the provinces when the sky was clouded and the earth parched with thirst. Such a declaration would have been blasphemous treason during the height of Old Kingdom power, when only the pharaoh could claim credit for Egypt's prosperity. Now, it was just a fact. The local boss was the one who fed you. This rapid decentralization created a political domino effect. As nomarchs gained independence, they redirected local resources taxes, grain labor away from the capital and into their own districts. Memphis, once the beating heart of Egypt's administrative network, gradually lost its influence over the distant provinces. It became a ghost of its former self, its palaces echoing and its granaries empty. Reduced revenues meant the pharaoh could no longer commission massive building projects or maintain extensive temple staffs, further eroding both his practical authority and his divine legitimacy. He couldn't build, he couldn't feed, he couldn't protect. What then was a god for? The end of the Old Kingdom is perfectly embodied by its last significant ruler, Pepi II. Traditional sources claim he ruled for an astonishing 94 years, which modern scholars believe was a curse that contributed to the instability. As he aged into irrelevance, real power diffused among competing factions at his court, while the distant provinces slipped completely from central control. By the end of his reign, Egypt had transformed from a unified kingdom into a collection of autonomous squabbling territories with only nominal allegiance to a throne that held no power. The weakening of central authority allowed regional religious practices to flourish for the first time in centuries. local temple complexes dedicated to provincial deities gained prominence, challenging the royal solar cults that had dominated Old Kingdom religion. Provincial elites redirected their resources to these local temples instead of funding royal monuments, permanently altering Egypt's religious landscape. The cosmic powers once channeled exclusively through the pharaoh were now dispersed among a multitude of local cults and priesthoods. The monopoly on divinity was over. The physical evidence of this decline is etched into the very stones of their tombs. The magnificent pyramids that had symbolized Old Kingdom splendor gave way to modest, poorly built structures. The last royal pyramid of the Old Kingdom, belonging to Pepi II, shows markedly reduced scale and shoddy quality compared to its predecessors at Giza. It was built of rubble and sand cased in limestone, a hollow imitation of past glory. After his death, even these diminished monuments became impossible to sustain. By 2160, BCE central authority had disintegrated entirely. The United Kingdom fractured into competing territories ruled by rival dynasties. Memphis lost its status as the sole capital. In the north, a new power center emerged at Heracleopolis. In the south, the city of Thebes began its rise to prominence. What followed was an era of regional conflicts, competing royal claims, and profound cultural transformation. Historians would later call it the First Intermediate Period. For the Egyptians living through it, it wasn't a period. It was the end of the world. The age of the god kings was dead. From its ashes, a new, harder, and more pragmatic Egypt would have to be born. Part 8. Chaos and Creativity. Renaissance in the ruins. For nearly a century, Egypt lay fractured. The old god kings were gone, their power broken by drought and famine. The map was now a messy patchwork of rival fiefdoms, with the northern kingdom, based in Heracleopolis, and the southern powerhouse of Thebes slowly, methodically building its strength. We call this the First Intermediate Period, a label that sounds tidy and academic. But for the people living through it, it was simply chaos. The central government was a memory. The Nile's flood was unreliable. And yet something remarkable happened in the silence left by the pharaoh's absence. When the rigid state-controlled structure of the Old Kingdom crumbled, it didn't just create a power vacuum, it created space. Space for innovation, for regional expression, and for a powerful new voice to emerge, the voice of the individual. This fragmented era, lasting from approximately 2160 to 2055 BCE, witnessed something unexpected, a cultural renaissance amid political chaos. The collapse of centralized authority didn't snuff out creativity, it unleashed it. Free from the rigid cookie-cutter conventions previously dictated by royal artisans from Memphis local workshops, developed distinctive artistic styles. In the provinces, a new artistic energy crackled to life. Provincial tombs at sites like Moala and Gebelin show breathtaking experimentation with new motifs and compositions. The scenes are more dynamic, more personal. There are depictions of bustling market scenes, intimate family moments, and brutal Civil War battles. This raw, vibrant art would have been unthinkable under the Old Kingdom's stifling standardization, where every image had to conform to a state-approved formula of divine glory. For the first time, art was beginning to reflect life, not just ideology. This new individualism exploded into literature, producing Egypt's first works of deep political commentary and social criticism. Without a powerful central pharaoh to enforce a single state-sanctioned narrative, scribes could put pen to papyrus and actually question the world around them. The most famous of these texts, the Instruction for Merikare, was composed by a Heracleopolitan king for his son. It's not a text of divine right. It's a shockingly practical guide to ruling in messy, uncertain times. Be skilled in speech, the king advises, that you may be strong. Speech is stronger than any weapon. Here was a ruler admitting that power wasn't just about divine mandate. It was about persuasion, administration, and pragmatism. But even more striking is the admonitions of Epure, a text that reads like a dystopian nightmare. This remarkable text depicts a world completely overturned, a society where the natural order has been inverted. The poor man is full of joy. The wealthy man is sorrowful. He who never built for himself now owns bullocks. He who had no bread now owns a barn. Some scholars interpret this as a visceral reaction to actual social upheaval, a first-hand account of revolution. Others see it as a cautionary tale, a warning against the catastrophic consequences of abandoning the traditional hierarchy. Either way, it's a window into a society grappling with profound trauma and questioning everything it once believed. This political fragmentation sparked a revolution in self-promotion. Tomb inscriptions from this era are remarkably candid about a leader's concrete achievements. Gone are the generic claims of upholding Maat. Instead, we get brash specific boasts. I gave bread to the hungry and clothes to the naked, they proclaim. This was a new social contract written in stone. Protection and provision, not divine heritage, is what earned loyalty. A leader was judged by his actions, not his bloodline. This was a seismic shift in political thinking. And with the old hierarchy shaken, archaeology reveals that provincial elites didn't just survive this period, they thrived. With reduced central control, local governors became kings of their own castles. Their tombs at sites like Asyut and Beni Hassan are not the pathetic imitations of royalty you might expect. They showcase elaborate decoration and funeral equipment that in some cases actually surpassed those of the contemporary kings holed up in Heracleopolis. These are displays of personal wealth and power that would have been politically impossible and probably fatal under the strong pharaonic rule of the Old Kingdom. They built impressive rock-cut tombs adorned with scenes of hunting, fishing, and agricultural abundance, celebrating their own personal success in keeping their little corner of Egypt alive and prosperous. The first intermediate period, for all its political chaos, created a unique window of opportunity for social mobility that the rigid Old Kingdom would have never permitted. Tomb biographies describe individuals who rose from humble beginnings to positions of authority based on competence and grit rather than noble birth. One man boasts of starting with nothing but his own two hands and rising to become a respected official. Fragmentation, while politically chaotic, allowed talent to surface in ways the old ossified hierarchy had actively prevented. It was a brutal Darwinian process, but it forced a meritocracy. This era of competing voices, regional pride, and artistic freedom couldn't last forever. The very logic of the Nile Valley, long unified and dependent on centralized management of irrigation, demanded a single authority. The stage was set for a reckoning. In the south, based at Thebes, a powerful family was consolidating power. Their king, Mentuhotep II, watched the squabbling of the north and saw his opportunity. After nearly a century of division, he began a relentless campaign of reunification around 2055 BCE. Through military might and strategic marriages, he gradually extended Theban control northward, crushing the Heracleopolitan kingdom. His victory was commemorated in his innovative mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahari, a structure that combined traditional pyramid elements with new terraced features cut into the cliffs, a perfect architectural metaphor for a new Egypt built on ancient foundations, but reaching for a new future. But from the ashes of the first intermediate period emerged not a simple restoration of the old top-down ways of the Old Kingdom. Something had changed forever. The experience of collapse had rewritten the contract between ruler and ruled. The pharaoh was back, but he could never again take his people's loyalty or his own divinity for granted. Part 9. The Theban Avengers, Reunification, and the Middle Kingdom Dawn. After nearly a century of division, the Nile Valley was a symphony of discord. Warlords squabbled over scraps of land, and the grand narrative of a unified Egypt felt like a forgotten myth. But in the south, in the city of Thebes, a determined rhythm was building. A local dynasty, the 11th, had been patiently consolidating its power, biding its time. Their king Mentuhotep II looked north at the fractured, weakened realm and saw not chaos, but an opportunity. Thebes was about to go from a provincial power to the master of the two lands. This wasn't just a reunification. It was a conquest that would fundamentally rewrite the soul of Egyptian kingship. Mentuhotep II began his campaign around 2055 BCE, and it was anything but a swift, clean victory. This was a grinding, methodical process of military campaigns and strategic political marriages, a slow strangulation of his rivals in the north. He didn't just want to defeat Heracleopolis. He wanted to absorb it to make Thebes the undeniable heart of a new Egypt. His victory was more than a military achievement. It was a statement. And he commemorated it not with a traditional pyramid, but with something entirely new, an architectural metaphor for his reign, his magnificent mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahari. Carved into the towering cliffs on the west bank of Thebes, the complex was a revelation. It abandoned the old freestanding pyramid form for a terraced structure of colonnades and ramps that seemed to both emerge from and merge with the natural rock face. It combined traditional elements, a small pyramid-like structure on the top terrace, with innovative features that reflected Egypt's changed cultural landscape. It was a powerful visual declaration. The new Egypt would be built on ancient foundations, but it would not be shackled by them. This was a king confident enough to break the mold. From the ashes of the first intermediate period emerged not a simple restoration of the old top-down autocracy of the Old Kingdom, but something revolutionary. While history remembers Mentuhotep II as Egypt's second unifier, what's often overlooked is how this reunification fundamentally rewrote the contract between ruler and ruled in ways that would echo through Egyptian civilization for the next 1,000 years. The experience of collapse had been a brutal teacher. The pharaoh was back, but he could never again be the remote, unassailable god-king of the pyramid age. The people had learned they could survive without one. After securing military victory, Mentuhotep faced the formidable challenge of healing a fractured society. The reunified kingdom required a new governing philosophy, and it started with a dramatic shift in geography. Unlike the Old Kingdom pharaohs, who ruled from distant Memphis, the Middle Kingdom rulers established their power center at Thebes. This wasn't merely a change of address. It represented a complete recalibration of Egyptian culture, religion, and governance. The center of gravity had shifted south permanently. The rise of Thebes brought profound religious changes that would shape Egypt for centuries. The local Theban deity Amun, previously a minor god of air and invisibility, began an astonishing ascent. Mentuhotep's royal propaganda skillfully merged this Theban deity with the older powerful sun god, Ra, creating Amun-Ra, a supreme state god whose name meant the hidden one of the sun. This was theological genius. It created continuity with the past while establishing a new religious authority centered squarely in Thebes. The king's own coronation name, Nebhepetre, meaning Lord of the Rudder is Re, explicitly connected him to solar theology while maintaining his distinctly Theban roots. He was steering the solar bark, and Thebes was its home port. Middle Kingdom rulers revolutionized the very concept of kingship. Royal inscriptions and literature from this period reveal a remarkable shift in how power was framed. The famous Tale of the Eloquent Peasant presents a narrative where even a common farmer wronged by a corrupt official can demand justice from the highest vizier and win. This new ideal of accessible kingship was captured in texts advising rulers to speak mat, do mat, suggesting that divine order wasn't simply enforced from above through monumental architecture, but was actively performed through righteous day-to-day governance. The pharaoh became a shepherd king, responsible for the welfare of his flock. His power was now contingent on his benevolence. This political transformation was etched into stone. The administrative system underwent complete reorganization. The Middle Kingdom introduced new titles and offices with particular emphasis on tightening control over provincial administration. The post of overseer of sealed things became especially important, essentially a chief treasurer managing Egypt's revitalized trade networks and the flow of goods. Administrative papyri from this era reveal a return to sophisticated record-keeping systems, meticulously tracking everything from agricultural production to expedition personnel. The bureaucracy was back, but it was leaner, meaner, and more efficient. Economic recovery demanded aggressive expansionism. The pharaohs dispatched military expeditions southward, establishing a chain of massive, intimidating fortresses along the Nubian frontier at strategic locations like Buhin and Semna. These weren't merely defensive structures. They were control points for crucial trade routes accessing sub-Saharan Africa's wealth: gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals. The Middle Kingdom saw renewed mining operations in the Sinai turquoise mines and expeditions to legendary locations like Punt, possibly modern Somalia, from which ships returned with living myrrh trees, frankincense, and leopards. Egypt was once again open for business. This era of pragmatic, responsible kingship, born from the trauma of collapse, would lay the groundwork for one of Egypt's most stable and sophisticated periods. The Middle Kingdom wasn't about building the biggest monuments. It was about building the smartest state. And it was all thanks to a Theban king who looked at a broken nation and decided to put it back together, not as it was, but as it needed to be. Part 10, The Golden Age. Engineering expansion and the 12th dynasty. The Middle Kingdom's promise forged by the Theban Avengers reached its dazzling intellectual peak under the 12th dynasty. This wasn't an age of crude, overwhelming force like the pyramid builders. This was an era of sophisticated control, of administrative genius, of using the mind as the ultimate instrument of power. Stretching from approximately 1991 to 1802 BCE, the 12th dynasty brought Egypt to unprecedented heights of efficiency and cultural sophistication. This was the Egyptian Renaissance, a golden age built not on unquestioned divinity, but on brilliant, calculated governance. The dynasty's founder, Amenemhat, I was a man who had seen the fragility of the state from the inside, likely having served as vizier before taking the crown. He established patterns of governance that his successors would perfect over nearly 2 centuries of remarkably stable rule. The throne passed smoothly from father to son, with a consistency that was a stark, deliberate contrast to the fragmentation that had plagued earlier periods. This was a corporate restructuring of the entire kingdom. Amenemhat, I even moved the capital from Thebes to a new centrally planned city called Ichtawi Caesar of the Two Lands, an administrative capital designed for efficiency, not sentiment. Under Senusret, Egypt's second 12th dynasty ruler, the kingdom embarked on an ambitious building program that would eventually dot the Nile Valley with monuments of refined elegance, not brute size. This pharaoh commissioned temples from the Delta to the Nubian frontier, but his most significant work was at Thebes at Karnak. Here, he didn't just build another temple. He established the sacred core. He erected a breathtaking central court with massive granite pillars, creating the foundations that would support Egypt's most sacred complex for centuries to come. It was an investment in religious infrastructure that would pay endless political dividends. But the dynasty's most impressive engineering achievements were hydrological, not architectural. The Fayum region, a vast natural depression southwest of Memphis, had been mostly marshland. The pharaohs, particularly the long-reigned Amenemhat III, saw its potential and transformed it through a complex network of canals, dikes, and irrigation systems that would make a modern engineer weep with admiration. The centerpiece was the creation of Lake Moeris, an enormous artificial reservoir that captured precious Nile floodwaters and released them during dry seasons. This hydrological marvel was the Gezira scheme of the ancient world, effectively extending Egypt's agricultural capacity by thousands of acres. It supported population growth and generated an agricultural surplus so vast it funded further state expansion and secured the loyalty of the people through full bellies. This was the real meaning of power controlling the water. In the realm of foreign policy, Senusret III emerged as the dynasty's most formidable military strategist and the archetype of the Middle Kingdom pharaoh. Unlike the campaigns of later New Kingdom pharaohs, which focused on flashy territorial conquest, Senusret's Nubian expeditions were cold calculated and aimed at securing pure economic interests, the gold mines and trade routes. His strategy involved a sophisticated combination of military intimidation and infrastructure development, exemplified by a series of massive, terrifying fortresses constructed at regular intervals along the Nubian frontier. These fortresses, with names like Buhin and Semna, represented military engineering on an unprecedented scale. They weren't simple lookout posts. They were colossal garrisons. Sites like Uranarti and Shalfak featured double walls up to 10 meters thick, defensive ditches, and purpose-built barracks capable of housing hundreds of soldiers. But they weren't purely military installations. They were also economic control centers, with workshops, granaries, and bureaucratic offices that managed the flow of goods between Egypt and its southern neighbors. They were the ultimate border control, a literal wall of Egyptian power designed to let wealth in and keep trouble out. The cultural achievements of the 12th dynasty were equally impressive, but in a quieter, more psychological way. Court artists developed a distinctive style that captured the immense weight of kingship. This is the era of hyper-realistic royal portraiture. Statues of Senusret III are breathtaking, not for their idealized perfection, but for their profound humanity. They show a ruler with furrowed brows, downturned mouth, and heavy-lidded eyes etched with lines of care. This is the face of a man who understands the burden of his position, the relentless responsibility of maintaining Ma'at. This artistic breakthrough suggests a profound shift in how kingship was conceptualized. No longer just a divine entitlement, but a serious, exhausting responsibility requiring wisdom, effort, and constant vigilance. This sense of order extended to the legal system. Standardized legal procedures developed during this golden age, with evidence in surviving papyri of formalized protocols for land transfers, inheritance disputes, and criminal proceedings. The role of judges became increasingly specialized, and local courts operated with standardized methods across the kingdom, ensuring a subject in Aswan could expect the same justice as one in Memphis. The 12th dynasty pharaohs built a government structure remarkable for its time, a careful, precarious balance between central authority and regional administration. Provincial governors remained powerful, but they were now checked by royal overseers who reported directly to the vizier. This sophisticated system of checks and balances allowed the bureaucracy to function with ruthless efficiency while preventing the regional independence that had undermined earlier dynasties. It was a machine that worked perfectly for 100 years. But for all its achievements, the Middle Kingdom rested on foundations more fragile than its monumental temples and mighty fortresses suggested. The very systems that had elevated Egypt to unprecedented heights contained vulnerabilities, a over-reliance on a single strong royal line, the immense power vested in the vicerate, the constant pressure at the borders. And when exploited, these vulnerabilities would usher in an era so chaotic, so humiliating, that later Egyptians would nearly erase it from their historical records. The Golden Age was about to end, not with a whisper, but with the thunder of hooves and the creak of foreign chariots. Part 11. The Hyksos, Invaders or Immigrants. The twilight of the 13th dynasty marked the beginning of the end for the Middle Kingdom's Golden Age. Unlike the strong hereditary succession of the 12th dynasty, these later rulers occupied the throne for increasingly shorter periods, some reigning mere months before being replaced. This rapid turnover wasn't just a quirk of history, it was a symptom of a fatal disease in the body politic. It created an administrative instability that rippled throughout the kingdom. With each new temporary pharaoh came shifts in policy and personnel gradually undermining the once impenetrable bureaucratic machine that had maintained Egypt's prosperity. The engine of state was sputtering as central authority weakened from within Egypt's borders, became increasingly porous. The Delta region, always Egypt's most vulnerable frontier, saw a gradual quiet infiltration, not of conquering armies, but of families. Canaanite peoples from the Levant began crossing the Sinai, not with swords drawn, but with tools packed. These newcomers weren't invaders in the classic sense. They were economic migrants, skilled traders, and pastoralists seeking opportunities in Egypt's still prosperous northern territories. They settled in trading centers, most notably at Avaris, slowly integrating into Egyptian society while maintaining connections to their homeland. For a time, it was a peaceful, pragmatic coexistence. They adopted Egyptian customs, worshipped Egyptian gods, particularly Seth, who they associated with their own storm, god Baal, and their leaders took Egyptian titles. It looked less like an invasion and more like a slow corporate merger. The final collapse of native central power came around 1650 BCE. It was then that a group of these well-integrated Asiatic settlers, known to the Egyptians as the Hekau Khasut, or Hyksos, a term meaning rulers of foreign lands, transitioned from influential immigrants to political masters. Under a king with the West Semitic name Salitis, they declared themselves Egypt's 15th dynasty, controlling the richest agricultural region, the Nile Delta, while relegating what remained of the native Egyptian royal line to a subordinate puppet status in the south. What makes the Hyksos takeover so fascinating isn't just that it happened, but how it happened. Unlike later invasions by the Assyrians or Persians, which were blunt exercises in brutal force, the Hyksos transition was subtler. Archaeological evidence from their capital of Avaris reveals a city with distinctly Levantine-style houses, a type of building known as a migdol, and burial customs, donkey sacrifices, interred with warriors existing comfortably alongside traditional Egyptian elements. Their seals and scarabs show Hyksos kings with thoroughly Egyptian royal titles and iconography, all while maintaining their foreign names and cultural distinctiveness. They weren't trying to erase Egypt. They were trying to become its masters to rule through a hybrid identity, but their most lasting impact was martial. The military revolution they brought with them transformed warfare in North Africa permanently. Having originated in the militarized zone between Mesopotamia and Egypt, the Hyksos possessed terrifyingly advanced technology. They introduced the horse-drawn chariot to Egypt, not the heavy ceremonial platforms Egyptians might have seen before, but lightweight, agile vehicles with spoked wheels designed for speed and maneuverability. These mobile platforms allowed archers to strike and retreat before Egyptian infantry could even respond, a tactical advantage Egypt had never before encountered. The Hyksos also brought improved metallurgy, producing stronger bronze weapons, new types of daggers, and the devastating khopesh, curved sword. They turned warfare into a thing of terrifying speed and reach. Meanwhile, in Upper Egypt, particularly in Thebes, a rump native Egyptian dynasty, the 17th, maintained a precarious independence. The archaeological record from their tombs tells a story of fascinating duality. They remain traditionally Egyptian in many respects, but they were pragmatic students of their enemies. Their tombs gradually begin to incorporate the very foreign weapons that had defeated them: Hyksos-style daggers, bronze armor, and images of chariots. They were adopting the tools of their overlords while cultivating a powerful growing narrative of resistance against the foreign occupation in the north. They learned the new rules of war, biding their time. What makes this period particularly difficult for historians to reconstruct is the scarcity of official documentation. The meticulous record-keeping of the Middle Kingdom vanishes. Administrative papyri virtually disappear. Historians are left to piece together events from private inscriptions, archaeological remains, and later accounts from New Kingdom pharaohs that are heavily colored by nationalistic propaganda, painting the Hyksos as brutal barbarian oppressors. The reality was far more complex. Even determining the sequence of kings during this period remains contentious among scholars. The Hyksos period wasn't simply a dark age of foreign oppression. Cultural exchange flowed in both directions. Hyksos rulers adopted Egyptian administrative practices, employed Egyptian scribes, and their kings took titles like Son of Ra. They worshipped Egyptian deities and employed Egyptian-style monumental architecture. Religious texts from this period show innovative theological combinations that would influence later traditions. They were in many ways more Egyptian than they were given credit for, but in Thebes, the slight was never forgotten. The mummy of Theban king Seqenenre tells a violent, visceral story. His skull is a mess of brutal trauma, bearing multiple wounds from Hyksos-style battle axes, suggesting he died on the battlefield, quite possibly facing the northern forces himself. His son Kamosi continued the struggle, leaving behind a victory stela that crackles with nationalistic fury. Why do I contemplate my strength, while there is a ruler in Avaris and another in Cush? And I sit united with an Asiatic and a Nubian, each man holding his slice of Egypt. The question was rhetorical. The answer was war. The humiliation of division had festered long enough. The new kingdom was about to begin, not with a whimper, but with a righteous, violent roar that would alter Egypt's destiny forever. The students were about to surpass their masters. Part 12, Driving Out the Foreigners, the Theban Resistance and the Birth of an Empire. The mummy of Theban king Seqenenre is a relic of pure, undiluted rage. His skull tells a story that official records never could. A mess of shattered bone, with wounds from Hyksos battle axes so vicious they must have been delivered by multiple assailants. His jaw is locked in a permanent, agonized scream. This was not a king who died in his sleep. He died face down in the mud fighting for a united Egypt. His brutal end became the rallying cry for a resistance that would birth an empire. His sons, Kamose and Amose, inherited more than a throne. They inherited a blood feud, a sacred mission to drive the Hyksos from Egyptian soil and restore the kingdom's dignity. This was no longer about politics. It was about vengeance. Following in the footsteps of his martyred father, Kamose launched a series of furious campaigns northward. He was the spark. His famous victory stela is not the measured pronouncement of a statesman. It's the defiant scream of a prince who could no longer tolerate the insult of a divided homeland. Why should I bother to even measure my strength? He rages. when there is a ruler in Avaris and another in Kush, and I sit here united with an Asiatic and a Nubian, each man holding his slice of Egypt. He portrays the Hyksos king, Apophis, not as a worthy rival, but as a pathetic figure, a woman with a plan who dares to complain that the hippos in Thebes are too loud and are disturbing his sleep hundreds of miles away. It's a brilliant piece of propaganda, painting the enemy as both weak and effeminate. Kamosi's campaigns were devastatingly effective. He pushed north, sacking towns and burning Hyksos ships, but he died before he could see the job finished. The final crushing blow would fall to his younger brother Ahmose. Ahmose, I was a different kind of leader. Where Kamose was the fiery revolutionary, Ahmose was the relentless strategist. He learned from the Hyksos, adopting their superior military technology, the composite bow, the horse and chariot, the improved khopesh sword, and turned their own weapons against them. Around 1550 BCE, after a long and brutal siege, his forces finally breached the formidable walls of Avaris. The victory was total. He drove the Hyksos from Egypt, and then in a move that revealed a new, aggressive mindset, he pursued them deep into their strongholds in southern Canaan, systematically destroying their power base to ensure they could never return. This wasn't just liberation, it was annihilation. But Ahmose's victory represented something far greater than simple revenge. It fundamentally transformed Egypt's worldview. The bitter generations-long memory of foreign domination left an indelible scar on the Egyptian consciousness, creating a lasting paranoid determination to prevent such humiliation from ever happening again. The once relatively insular kingdom now adopted an aggressively expansionist military posture. The lesson was clear. Splendid isolation was a vulnerability. True security meant pushing outward to create massive buffer zones and securing its frontiers against any potential threat. Egypt was no longer content to be a kingdom. It sought to control its destiny by dominating its neighbors. It would become an empire. The military that made this expansion possible was a completely revolutionized force. The Egyptians, in a stunning irony, had learned from their former Hyksos rulers. The chariot became the centerpiece of Egyptian warfare, a sleek mobile platform from which elite archers could rain arrows on enemy formations before executing a swift, devastating retreat. Military careers became prestigious pathways to power and wealth, with successful generals often rewarded with vast estates and significant political influence. The army itself was transformed from an ad hoc force, raised for specific campaigns, into a permanent professional institution, complete with dedicated divisions and a hardened officer corps. Thebes remained the spiritual and administrative heart of this new militant Egypt. Its importance was reinforced by massive construction projects that celebrated the victorious dynasty. But the true power behind the throne increasingly rested with the priesthood of Amun, who had bankrolled and blessed the Theban royal family during their long struggle. In gratitude, Ahmose and his successors lavished unprecedented wealth and authority upon Amun's temples, elevating this once regional deity to the status of a nationalistic imperial god. The merging of Amun with the sun god Ra created Amun-Ra, the supreme deity, whose earthly representatives, the priests, now wielded immense political and economic power, forming a powerful theocratic partnership with the throne. The economic engine that fueled this new imperial age ran on three things: the gold mines of conquered Nubia, the annual tribute of conquered peoples, and the reopening of lucrative trade routes that had been disrupted during the Hyksos period. Ahmose not only rebuilt what had been destroyed, but expanded Egypt's infrastructure, commissioning new quarries and trading expeditions to secure the luxury goods that the newly enriched elite craved. Stone timber and exotic materials flowed into Egypt in quantities never before seen, enabling a construction boom that would reshape the landscape for generations. Military conquest alone did not secure Egypt's new position. Diplomatic marriages treaties and the careful placement of loyal administrators created a complex network of relationships that bound foreign territories to Egyptian interests. The children of foreign rulers were often brought to Egypt for a royal education, a form of polite hostage-taking that ensured their parents' continued loyalty while simultaneously grooming the next generation of leaders to be sympathetic to Egyptian culture and values. The court culture that developed during this period reflected Egypt's new cosmopolitan, confident character. Foreign influences in art, language, and fashion became prestigious rather than rejected. The royal family embraced certain aspects of international style while maintaining distinctly Egyptian religious practices and royal iconography. This cultural flowering would reach its peak under the reign of a woman who shattered every convention, and a boy king who would become Egypt's greatest conqueror. The humiliation was over. The age of the warrior pharaohs had begun. Part 13. Warrior Pharaohs. Building an empire. At its zenith, Egypt's empire stretched an almost unimaginable 2,000 miles from north to south, a superpower fueled by a steady stream of tribute and terror. Conquered territories sent their wealth directly to the pharaoh's treasury shiploads of Lebanese cedar Nubian gold, Levantine copper, and slaves. The ambitious rulers of the 18th dynasty, their confidence forged in the fire of expelling the Hyksos, transformed what had begun as a defensive strategy into an unprecedented, ruthless imperial machine. This was the era of the warrior pharaoh, and their battlefield prowess became the new liturgy for maintaining Ma'ati. The architect of this imperial vision was Thutmose Thupper. He didn't just push Egypt's boundaries, he shattered them, campaigning with a brutal efficiency deep into Syria and establishing a new frontier at the very banks of the Euphrates River. This was a psychological masterstroke, placing Egyptian power on the doorstep of Mesopotamia's great kingdoms. To commemorate this remarkable expansion, he did something no pharaoh had ever done. He erected a victory stela beside the great river, a stone billboard declaring Egypt's northeastern boundary to the world. It was the ultimate flex, but it was his grandson, Thutmose III, who truly earned his reputation as Egypt's Napoleon, a military genius who fused strategic brilliance with utter ruthlessness. Taking the throne after the death of his stepmother, Hatshepsut, he unleashed a torrent of violence, conducting an astonishing 17 campaigns over 20 years. He systematically subdued territories from the Fourth Cataract in Sudan to the banks of the Orontes in Syria. His name became a synonym for invincibility. His most celebrated victory came at the strategic fortress city of Megiddo, a site so associated with apocalyptic battles that its name, Armageddon, would echo through millennia. Thutmose faced a massive coalition of Canaanite princes who had thrown off the Egyptian yoke. His generals, cautious and conventional, advised taking one of the long, safe roads around the city. Thutmose listened, then made a decision that defines the boldness of his reign. Rejecting their counsel, he declared, "I shall go on this road of Megiddo. If you really love me, follow me." He then led his forces in a desperate single-file march through the treacherously narrow Aruna Pass, gambling his entire army on surprise. It worked. He emerged behind the enemy forces, who were deployed to defend the expected routes. The coalition army, caught completely off guard, scattered in panic. The subsequent siege of Megiddo lasted 7 months, ending with the city's submission and the humbling of numerous rebellious city-states. The Egyptian military machine became a terrifying instrument under these warrior pharaohs. Beyond the elite chariot corps, they employed specialized divisions of archers, infantry, and scouts, all operating with coordinated precision. Their logistics were a nightmare of efficiency, supplying armies hundreds of miles from home. Thutmose III's son, Amenhotep II boasted of his own martial prowess with propagandistic flair, claiming he could shoot arrows through solid copper targets while driving a chariot at full speed. Whether true or exaggerated, such tales were designed to reinforce the image of the pharaoh as an invincible, superhuman warrior king, a demigod leading a divine war machine. Perhaps most remarkable was the administrative infrastructure that supported this imperial dominion, turning fleeting victories into permanent control. Egypt established garrison towns throughout its conquered territories, each a mini Thebes, with its own military commander, tax collectors, and diplomatic representatives. The system of indirect rule was a masterclass in pragmatic imperialism. Local rulers who submitted were allowed to keep their thrones, provided they sent their heirs to Egypt for a royal education, a thinly disguised form of hostage-taking that ensured compliance while culturally assimilating the next generation of leadership. This system allowed Egypt to control vast territories with minimal manpower, ruling through local proxies who were loyal to the pharaoh's gold and fearful of his chariots. The records of these triumphs were meticulously documented as powerful propaganda. On the walls of Karnak Temple, Thutmose III commissioned the annals a detailed, hyper-specific account of his campaigns. It reads like a brutalist accountant's ledger of conquest: 924 chariots, 2,238 horses, 503 foreign nobles captured, followed by enormous, meticulously itemized quantities of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and other plunder. These weren't mere boasts. They were proof of divine mandate, demonstrating the pharaoh's role as the guarantor of cosmic order through military supremacy. The message was clear: the gods rewarded the righteous with victory and loot. This imperial success story transformed Egyptian society itself, creating a new cosmopolitan elite. Foreign goods became the ultimate status symbols. Minoan-inspired frescoes adorned palace walls at Tel el-Daba. Levantine jewelry appeared in noble tombs at Thebes. Exotic foods from Syria and Punt graced royal tables. The empire also came home in more subtle ways. Canaanite gods like Baal and Astarte were incorporated into the Egyptian pantheon. Even the Egyptian language absorbed hundreds of loanwords from its subject peoples, particularly military and trade terminology. The empire created a new class of officials, diplomats, translators, and military officers with international experience and multilingual skills. Royal messengers traveled between great courts, carrying diplomatic correspondence written in Akkadian cuneiform, the lingua franca of the day. The famous Amarna letters reveal a sophisticated network of relationships between Egypt and the other great powers, the Hittites, Mitanni, Assyrians, and Babylonians, who addressed the pharaoh as brother. Egypt was now at the center of the world. Part 14. The Pharaoh Who Was a King. Hatshepsut's reign of peace and prosperity. Among those pharaohs who expanded Egypt's monuments and its reach, one stands apart not for military triumphs, but for shattering ancient gender barriers with a quiet, calculated brilliance. When Thutmose II died unexpectedly around 1479 BCE, the court was thrown into chaos. He left behind a young heir, Thutmose III, a mere infant and a royal widow, his half-sister and chief wife Hatshepsut. No one could have predicted that this queen would transform from regent to Egypt's most successful female pharaoh, a ruler whose legacy would be so threatening that future kings would attempt to chisel her very existence from history. Hatshepsut began her reign conventionally enough, serving as regent for her young stepson. But within a few years, she took an unprecedented step. She didn't just rule. She declared herself king of Upper and Lower Egypt. This wasn't merely a change in title. It was a complete systematic rewriting of the rules of Egyptian kingship. She commissioned statues and reliefs that showed her in the traditional male regalia of a pharaoh, the Nemes headdress, the Shendit kilt, and even the ceremonial false beard. Yet in a fascinating duality, she often maintained her identity as a woman. In some depictions, she appears with a masculine torso and kingly regalia. In others, her delicate facial features, narrow waist, and the curve of her breasts remain visible beneath the symbols of power. She wasn't trying to be a man. She was creating a new category, the female king. The political maneuvering behind her rise reveals a diplomat's genius. Rather than displacing Thutmose III entirely, she maintained him as her co-ruler, a junior partner in the royal enterprise. This clever move neutralized potential opposition from his faction, while she gradually claimed primary authority. She secured the crucial support of high officials, particularly a brilliant commoner named Senenmut, who rose from humble origins to become her chief architect, the tutor of her daughter, and possibly her closest confidant. Her power base also extended to the immensely influential priesthood of Amun, whose temples she expanded and enriched with generous donations, ensuring their divine endorsement of her unconventional rule. Hatshepsut's reign stands out in a dynasty of warrior kings for its prioritization of economic prosperity over military expansion. While her male predecessors and successors measured greatness in battlefield victories and plunder, she focused on rebuilding Egypt's trading networks and restoring its internal wealth. Her most famous achievement was not a conquered city, but a successful commercial expedition to the fabled land of Punt, a place shrouded in mystery, likely located near modern-day Eritrea or Somalia. The journey is immortalized in exquisitely detailed reliefs at her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. They show the great Egyptian ships setting sail, their sails billowing and returning laden with treasures far more valuable than spoils of war. Living myrrh trees, with their roots carefully bound in baskets for replanting in Egypt, stacks of frankincense resin, ebony ivory gold, and exotic animals, including baboons and leopards. The scene depicting the portly queen of Punt, with its candid and almost humorous realism, is a testament to the artist's keen observation. The Punt expedition wasn't just a commercial success, it was a masterpiece of political theater. It displayed Egypt's reach and Hatshepsut's unique ability to acquire exotic luxury goods through trade and diplomacy without the cost and bloodshed of warfare. Architecturally, Hatshepsut transformed Egypt's landscape. Her crowning achievement, the mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, is one of ancient Egypt's most sublime and innovative designs. Built into the soaring cliffs opposite Thebes, its three elegant colonnaded terraces create a perfect harmony between architectural precision and the natural grandeur of the landscape. It feels more like a part of the earth than a structure placed upon it. The temple served multiple purposes: a stunning monument to her reign, a venue for her mortuary cult, and powerful stone-cut propaganda demonstrating her legitimacy as pharaoh. To solidify her claim to the throne, Hatshepsut employed theology with remarkable sophistication. She commissioned a series of reliefs depicting her own divine conception. In them, the god Amun takes the form of her father, Thutmose I, and visits her mother, Ahmose. Amun holds the Ankh of life to Ahmose's nose, and Khnum, the potter god, is shown at his wheel, creating Hatshepsut and her Ka spirit. This origin story elevated her claim above mere human politics into the realm of cosmic inevitability. She was not just royally born, she was divinely created to rule. She also emphasized her role in maintaining Ma'at by restoring monuments neglected during the Hyksos period, reopening trade routes, and celebrating religious festivals with unprecedented magnificence. For approximately 22 years, Hatshepsut ruled a peaceful and prosperous Egypt. The empire remained stable, the treasury was full, and monumental construction flourished. Yet after her death, Her successor, Thutmose III, now ruling alone, began a systematic campaign to remove her from official history. Her name and image were meticulously chiseled from monuments, her statues toppled and smashed, her obelisks walled up, and her achievements reassigned to Thutmose II or Thutmose III himself. This attempted erasure wasn't merely personal revenge. It represented a desperate effort to restore the traditional exclusive male nature of Egyptian kingship that Hatshepsut had so effectively challenged, and to secure Thutmose III's own legacy by erasing the powerful woman who had overshadowed his early reign. It was an act of historical editing meant to pretend a glorious, successful, and utterly anomalous chapter had never happened. Part 15. The Heretic King. Akhenaten's Religious Revolution. Egyptian history features few true revolutionaries. Most pharaohs worked within the system, honoring the gods of their fathers, building upon the traditions of their predecessors. But the pharaoh, who would come to be known as Akhenaten, took a radical approach that would create such profound shockwaves that Egyptians would later do everything possible to pretend it never happened. While earlier rulers, like Hatshepsut, challenged tradition within existing frameworks, Amenhotep IV shattered Egypt's foundational religious system entirely. He didn't just want to be a different kind of pharaoh. He wanted to build a whole new world, and he was willing to burn the old one down to do it. Born around 1380, BCE, Amenhotep IV initially ruled conventionally from Thebes, making offerings to Amun and the traditional pantheon. But in his fifth regnal year, he underwent a spiritual transformation so drastic it would alter Egyptian society forever. The entire complex, centuries-old pantheon of gods, Amun-Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, and hundreds more suddenly became secondary to a single deity, the Aten. This wasn't merely elevating one god above others in a typical Egyptian syncretic fashion. It was effectively canceling the worship of all other deities. The Aten was represented not as a god in human or animal form, but as a solar disk, the physical sun, with rays ending in tiny hands that reached out to offer the Ankh, the symbol of life to the royal family. It was an abstract, distant, and exclusive force. To cement this religious revolution, Amenhotep IV changed his birth name to Akhenaten, meaning effective spirit of the Aten, signaling a complete and violent break with the past. More dramatically, he abandoned the ancient capital of Thebes with its powerful entrenched priesthood of Amun and its massive wealth-filled temples, and struck out into the desert. On a virgin site on the east bank of the Nile, he ordered the construction of an entirely new purpose-built capital city named Akhetaten Horizon of the Aten. This planned metropolis, modern day, Amarna, rose from the sand within just a few years, a monument to absolute will. The city was a physical manifestation of his heresy. It featured open-air temples, where the sun's rays could directly touch the altars, palaces with unroofed courtyards, and broad avenues aligned with the sun's path. The entire city was designed to worship the light. The revolution extended beyond religion into art and culture, smashing conventions that had remained largely unchanged for over 1,000 years. Egyptian art was suddenly replaced with a style so distinctive, archaeologists can immediately identify Amarna period art. Royal figures, particularly Akhenaten himself, were depicted with an unsettling androgyny, an elongated skull, a gaunt face with heavy-lidded eyes, full lips, a thin neck, a soft, almost feminine torso with wide hips and breasts and spindly limbs. More remarkably, this new art humanized the god-king in unprecedented ways. The pharaoh was depicted in shockingly intimate family scenes, kissing his children, dancing with his wife, relaxing with his mother, or dining with Nefertiti. These were not the stoic, idealized images of remote divinity. They were snapshots of a real breathing family, albeit a bizarrely proportioned one. This was all part of the theology only the royal family could directly interact with the Aten. The sun's rays depicted with hands offered life only to Akhenaten and Nefertiti, who then acted as sole intermediaries to dispense this life to the people. The people were cut off from their gods and made entirely dependent on the royal family for divine favor. Queen Nefertiti, whose name means the beautiful one has come, was far more than a consort in this new order. She was a co-ruler, a near-equal partner. She appears in scenes traditionally reserved for kings smiting enemies, offering to the Aten and riding in a chariot. Her famous limestone bust, discovered in 1912, reveals not only her legendary timeless beauty, but also her political significance and power. Some scholars believe that after Akhenaten's death, Nefertiti may have ruled briefly as sole pharaoh under the name Nefer-Neferuaten, or the mysterious Smenkhkare, a final defiant act of the Amrana experiment. While this religious and artistic revolution consumed Akhenaten's attention, Egypt's vast empire began crumbling at the edges. Letters discovered in the ruins of Amarna. The Amarna letters reveal increasingly desperate pleas from vassal kings in Canaan and Syria, begging for Egyptian military support against encroaching enemies like the Hittites and the Habiru. "May the king, my lord, save his land from the hands of the enemy," one ruler writes. Another warns, "All the lands of the king, my lord, are lost." Akhenaten's response was minimal, often just a request for more information. He appeared more concerned with perfecting the rituals for his sole god and building his perfect city than maintaining the international power his ancestors had fought for. Within Egypt itself, the changes proved deeply unpopular. The priesthood of Amun, once the wealthiest and most powerful religious institution in the land, was effectively disbanded. Their temples were closed, their names and images chiseled from monuments in a wave of state-sanctioned vandalism, and their vast economic holdings redirected to the worship of the Aten. Ordinary Egyptians found themselves cut off from the familiar gods who had governed every aspect of daily life: birth, death, harvest, love for millennia. Their local shrines were abandoned, their household gods forbidden. The comforting, predictable rhythm of religious life was replaced by the harsh, abstract light of a distant sun disk that only the king could truly know. The revolution from above had left the people below in a spiritual desert, longing for the return of their gods. Part 16. The Boy King and the Return to Order. While Akhenaten's name was being systematically erased from history, his successor would eventually become one of the most recognized figures in all of archaeology, yet not for any great achievement during his lifetime. The paradox of Tutankhamun lies in how his unremarkable reign, cut tragically short, produced history's most remarkable archaeological discovery. He was a boy king who became a global icon precisely because he was forgotten his tiny packed tomb, overlooked by thieves for over 3,000 years. In the chaotic aftermath of Akhenaten's religious revolution, Egypt found itself with a child on the throne, a boy of merely 9 years old. Originally named Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, he inherited not just a throne, but a kingdom in spiritual crisis. The real power lay not in his small hands, but with the elderly court officials who had weathered his father's storm. Chief among them were the Vizier Ai, a cunning political survivor, and the military commander Horemheb. These men had watched as Egypt's international standing diminished and its internal cohesion fractured under Akhenaten's single-minded obsession. Now, with a malleable young ruler as their figurehead, they swiftly began the urgent work of undoing the damage of steering the ship of state back into familiar waters. The most significant policy document of Tutankhamun's reign was the Restoration Stela, a proclamation that reads like a political ad for a return to normalcy. It paints a grim picture of Egypt under Atenism, a land abandoned by the gods. The temples and the cities of the gods and goddesses were fallen into decay, and their shrines were fallen into ruin, having become mere mounds of rubble with weeds growing. The stela announced the reopening of the old temples, the restoration of their priesthoods, and the reinstatement of their offerings. It was more than administrative reform. It was a theological correction, justifying the return to orthodoxy by describing the gods' abandonment of Egypt during Akhenaten's heresy. It was the ultimate "I told you so" carved in stone. Behind this royal decree stood Tutankhamun's vizier, and likely his great-uncle or grandfather. Was the ultimate political survivor. He had navigated the dangerous currents of the Amarna period, likely serving in Akhenaten's court, while maintaining his traditional religious connections. Now, with a child king under his guidance, he orchestrated Egypt's great religious revival. Alongside him, General Horemheb managed military affairs, working to rebuild Egypt's neglected international relations and defensive capabilities, which had frayed as vassals watched the empire's attention turn inward. The young king became the perfect vessel for this restoration. Buildings at Karnak Temple show Tutankhamun his name now changed from the Aten-associated Tutankhaten to the Amun-affirming Tutankhamun, making offerings to Amun-Ra and other traditional deities. Skilled craftsmen and artisans who had been forced to work in the strange Amarna style were recalled to Thebes to repair the damaged statues of the gods, their tools once again carving the familiar, idealized features of the old pantheon. Tutankhamun's cartouches appear on restored monuments throughout Egypt, symbolically reclaiming them for Orthodox religion. Far from mere religious posturing, these acts represented a desperate bid to restore cosmic order to a kingdom believed to have fallen into chaos under Akhenaten. Despite these efforts, Tutankhamun's actual control over state affairs remained limited throughout his short life. Modern science has given us a heartbreakingly intimate portrait of the boy behind the golden mask. DNA analysis of his mummy confirms he suffered from multiple physical ailments. He had a crippling clubfoot that required him to use over 130 walking sticks found in his tomb. He also had a cleft palate and suffered from malaria, the parasites of which were found in his remains. These health challenges, likely resulting from generations of royal incest, left him frail and in constant pain. This was no invincible warrior pharaoh. He was a sickly teenager, relying on his canes and advisors to navigate the immense responsibilities thrust upon him. When Tutankhamun died, unexpectedly, around age 18 or 19, he left no heir to continue the dynasty. His young widow, Ankhesenamun, was placed in a terrifyingly precarious position. In a move of sheer desperation, archaeological evidence suggests she may have written to the Hittite king, Suppiluliuma, with an astonishing request. "My husband has died. I have no son. They say you have many sons. If you would send me one of your sons, he could become my husband. I will never take a servant of mine and make him my husband." This was a breathtaking diplomatic gamble, a plea for a foreign prince to take the throne of Egypt. It failed spectacularly. The Hittite prince Zananza was murdered on his way to Egypt, likely assassinated by factions loyal to and Horemheb, for whom a Hittite ruler was an unthinkable outcome. Instead, the elderly assumed the throne, marrying Ankhesenamun to legitimize his claim. When died after a short rule, the military strongman Horemheb seized power. These men would complete the erasure of the Amarna period from official history, hacking out the names of Akhenaten Tutankhamun and from the king lists to create the fiction of a direct line from Amenhotep III to Horemheb. Had history unfolded differently, Tutankhamun would have remained a forgotten footnote, a minor transitional figure in the aftermath of a failed revolution. However, on November 4th, 1922, Howard Carter's discovery of his nearly intact tomb in the Valley of the Kings transformed this insignificant king into archaeology's greatest celebrity. The spectacular funerary artifacts, including the solid gold mask that has become the very symbol of ancient Egypt, revealed the incredible artistry of the period. The 398 cataloged items from his burial chamber chariots, beds, weapons game boards, and jars of wine provide our most comprehensive window into the lavish royal funeral practices of the New Kingdom. His name, chosen for him by men seeking a return to order, would ironically become the most famous of all Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. In death, he achieved what he never could. In life, he restored glory to Egypt, not as a powerful pharaoh, but as its most magnificent ghost. Part 17, Ramses the Great, the last age of gods on earth. While many pharaohs claimed divine status, only one would successfully blur the line between man and God so effectively that 3,000 years later, we still know him simply as the Great. Born into the 19th dynasty around 1303, BCE, Ramses II ascended to the throne in his early 20s, following the brief solid reign of his father, Seti I. What followed was an unprecedented 66-year rule, a reign so long that most of his subjects could not remember a time before him. He would transform Egypt's landscape, both physically and culturally, becoming the living embodiment of the empire itself. By the time of his death, at the remarkable age of 90, he had fathered over 100 children, with his numerous wives and concubines, effectively creating his own dynasty within a dynasty and ensuring his bloodline was woven inextricably into the fabric of the nation. The scale of Ramses' architectural ambition remains almost incomprehensible. While previous pharaohs built impressive monuments, Ramses built on a scale that bordered on the obsessive and maniacal drive for immortality in stone. The temples at Abu Simbel stand as his most extraordinary achievement. These were not built, they were carved. Massive structures hewn directly into the living sandstone cliffs overlooking the Nile in Nubia. The main temple's entrance is flanked by 4 colossal seated figures of Ramses himself, each reaching a height of 66 feet, their impassive faces staring across the water into eternity. Most ingeniously, the temple was designed with perfect astronomical alignment. Twice a year, on February 22nd and October 22nd, the rising sun would penetrate the entire 200-foot length of the temple to illuminate the statues of Ramses and the gods Amun and Ra, seated in the sacred inner sanctum, leaving only the statue of Ptah, god of darkness, symbolically in shadow. It was a calendar, a clock, and a monument to his own divinity all in one. Beyond Abu Simbel, Ramses II was a branding machine. He expanded or constructed over a dozen major temples, commissioned countless statues, often by simply recarving those of his predecessors, and built an entire new capital city. His mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, contained a seated colossus of himself that originally weighed over 1,000 tons, a feat of engineering that would challenge modern capabilities. At Karnak and Luxor, massive columns and courtyards bore his name. His new capital, Pi-Ramesses, in the Delta, was described in texts as sparkling like the horizon of heaven, a vast administrative and military center filled with palaces, gardens, and workshops. He didn't just build monuments. He built a world in his own image. While remembered primarily as a builder, Ramses was determined to establish his military reputation early. In the 5th year of his reign, he led an ambitious campaign against the Hittite Empire, the other superpower of the age, at the city of Kadesh in modern Syria. The battle nearly ended in disaster for the young pharaoh. Lured by false intelligence, he raced ahead with his division, only to find himself separated from the bulk of his army and surrounded by 2,500 Hittite chariots. What happened next depends on who you ask. Ramses's account, plastered across the walls of Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum Karnak Luxor, and Abydos, tells of a miraculous victory. He portrays himself single-handedly, fighting off the Hittite horde, a superhuman figure felling enemies by the dozen until reinforcements arrived. "I was alone," he declared. "My infantry and my chariotry had deserted me." The reality was likely a bloody, stalemated draw, but Ramses's propaganda machine transformed it into Egypt's greatest triumph, a tale retold with increasingly elaborate embellishments for the rest of his reign. He understood that perception was power, and a story well told could be more valuable than a battle barely won. This campaign eventually led to a far more significant achievement, the world's first recorded peace treaty, finalized in 1258 BCE. Inscribed in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform, the agreement established boundaries, a military alliance, and even extradition policies between the two exhausted superpowers. It proved so historically significant that a replica now hangs at the United Nations headquarters in New York as an ancient symbol of diplomacy. Ramses' favorite queen, the beautiful Nefertari, received honors unlike any queen before her. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens, QV66, is a masterpiece containing some of the most exquisite paintings ever created in ancient Egypt, their vibrant blues and yellows still stunningly visible after more than 3 millennia. When she died, Ramses commissioned a magnificent temple at Abu Simbel, dedicated to her and the goddess Hathor, placing her statue on an equal scale with his own on the facade, an almost unheard of honor. Perhaps most telling of Ramses's character was his penchant for appropriation. Throughout Egypt, older statues, obelisks, and buildings were inscribed with his cartouches, often replacing the names of previous kings. This wasn't mere vanity. It was a calculated program of historical airbrushing to ensure his omnipresence. He was rewriting history to position himself at the absolute center of Egypt's narrative, a permanent, inescapable feature of the landscape. The immortality Ramses sought through stone proved remarkably successful. We still know his name, his face, his story. Yet the empire he spent a lifetime strengthening began unraveling almost immediately after his death, its foundations weakened by the very weight of his ego. The God King was mortal after all. Part 18, The End of Glory, Sea Peoples, Tomb Robbers, and Priestly Kings. Though Ramses II had positioned himself as the center of Egypt's narrative, the chapters that followed his death revealed how quickly even the mightiest legacies can fade. The succession problems began immediately. His 13th son, Merneptah, was already a man in his 60s when he finally took the throne, inheriting an empire that was already showing cracks under the weight of his father's endless monument building and military posturing. Though he successfully repelled new threats, Libyan invasions, and the first ominous incursions of the mysterious Sea Peoples, his reign marked the beginning of Egypt's slow, inexorable decline. The power vacuum intensified after his death, leading to a period of succession disputes and short-lived reigns that saw the throne change hands with dizzying speed. The dynasty that followed the 20th was a parade of pale imitators, a desperate attempt to recapture past glory through nomenclature. A succession of rulers from Ramses III through Ramses V adopted the legendary name in hopes of invoking the power and authority of their great predecessor. This naming convention reveals much about ancient Egyptian thinking. Names carried power, a magical essence. By adopting the name of history's most successful pharaoh, these lesser rulers hoped to channel his strength and legitimacy. But it was a hollow performance. Each successive Ramses represented a further diminishment of actual power, a desperate clinging to the appearance of Egypt's former grandeur, while its actual influence waned to little more than the Nile Valley itself. Among these successors, Ramses III stands out as perhaps the last truly effective pharaoh, the final bulwark against total collapse. His reign was defined by firefighting. When the mysterious Sea Peoples, a confederation of naval raiders from various Mediterranean regions, swept through the eastern Mediterranean around 1175 BCE, they were an existential threat. They destroyed the Hittite Empire, laid waste to coastal cities from Greece to the Levant, and brought the Bronze Age world to its knees. Ramses III met them at the Nile Delta in a massive naval and land engagement. The battle scenes recorded in stunning chaotic detail at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu show Egyptian archers firing volleys into enemy ships from the decks of their own vessels while the pharaoh's navy boxed in the invaders. The accompanying text boasts, "Those who reached my frontier, their seed is not. Their heart and soul are finished forever and ever." Yet this victory proved Pyrrhic. The tremendous military expenditure drained Egypt's treasury and depleted its resources. The civilization, though saved from immediate destruction, never fully recovered its international standing or economic vitality. The strain manifested internally almost immediately. We have the records. From the workmen's village of Deir el-Medina comes evidence of the first recorded labor strike in history. The artisans and craftsmen who built and decorated the royal tombs walked off the job because their monthly grain rations, their pay, had fallen months behind. They staged a sit-in at the mortuary temples, declaring, "We are hungry." It was an unthinkable act of defiance in the age of the pyramid, builders a sign that the covenant between the state and its people was broken. The pharaoh could no longer feed his most elite workers. Ramses III's end was as troubled as his reign. In what is now known as the Harem Conspiracy, a cabal of secondary wives officials and palace priests plotted to assassinate the king and place a minor prince Pentawere on the throne. For centuries, it was just a story from judicial papyri detailing the trials and brutal executions of the conspirators. Then modern science intervened. CT scans of Ramses III's mummy revealed a deep, fatal cut across his throat, hidden by the funeral wrappings. The blade had severed his trachea and esophagus, killing him almost instantly. The conspiracy had succeeded. The pharaoh, the guardian of Egypt, had been murdered in his own palace by his own family. The pharaohs who followed faced mounting troubles on all fronts. The most symbolic decay was the epidemic of tomb robberies that became endemic throughout the Theban necropolis. The sacred Valley of the Kings, once impenetrable, was now systematically looted by gangs that often included corrupt officials and priests. The tomb robbery papyri detail the investigations and trials, offering a bleak portrait of a society losing its reverence. Thieves confessed under torture to breaking into royal burials, desecrating mummies to strip them of gold and jewels. We found the noble mummy of this king. There was a sword tied to it. We took the gold we found on the noble mummy of this king. One testimony reads, "Even the great Ramses II was not spared." Investigators later reported finding his tomb violated all the supplies of the royal children, which are in this place, broken into. The ancestors were no longer sacred. They were inventory. As central control, weakened power devolved to regional authorities. The most powerful were the high priests of Amun at Karnak. Controlling the vast temple estates and treasury of the state god, they began to function almost as independent rulers. The most prominent Herihor went so far as to place his name within royal cartouches and adopt full royal titulary, effectively declaring himself king of southern Egypt, while the last Ramesside kings maintained only nominal control from Pi-Ramesses in the north. Egypt was splitting in two, as by the end of the reign of Ramses I, around 1069, BCE Egypt had fundamentally transformed. The unified new kingdom that once commanded respect from Syria to Sudan had fractured. foreign influences penetrated deeper into Egyptian society. The country slid into the Third Intermediate Period, an era where Libyan military commanders would establish their own dynasties, and eventually Nubian kings would conquer Egypt from the south, turning former vassals into overlords. This wasn't just political fragmentation. It was the complete inversion of everything that had made Egypt Egypt for over 1,000 years. The age of god kings was over. The age of priests, mercenaries, and divided rule had begun. Part 19. Black Pharaohs and Assyrian Invaders. As temple rituals continued uninterrupted during Egypt's political chaos, a powerful force was gathering strength far to the south. Beyond the first cataract, beyond even the second, the ancient kingdom of Kush was preparing to rewrite Egyptian history in the most unexpected way imaginable. Around 745 BCE, while Egypt's regional powers squabbled amongst themselves, Kushite warriors crossed the border, not as simple invaders, but as self-proclaimed saviors of a civilization they deeply revered. The Kushite rulers of the 25th dynasty viewed their intervention not as a foreign conquest, but as a divine mission to rescue Egypt from itself. King Pia, also called Pianki, the dynasty's founder, marched north with an army infused with religious purpose. His famous victory stela, discovered at his capital Napata, reveals his motivations went beyond mere territorial ambition. When confronting the feuding Egyptian princes, he expressed horror not at their resistance, but at their ritual impurity. They had entered his presence without proper purification, and worse, had neglected the sacred temples under their stewardship. How can you stand in the house of Horus with unclean bodies? Pia reportedly demanded of the Egyptian nobles who surrendered to him. Unlike previous conquerors who looted Egypt's treasures, Pia insisted on maintaining strict ritual purity throughout his campaign. Before entering the sacred city of Memphis, he purified himself with water from the sacred lake and made elaborate offerings to Ptah, demonstrating his commitment to Egyptian religious traditions. He wasn't a foreigner. He was the most Egyptian of them all. The Kushite kings were no outsiders to the culture they now ruled. They had absorbed and practiced Egyptian religion, art, and statecraft for centuries. Their administration used hieroglyphic writing. They built their own pyramids, smaller, steeper, and more numerous than Egypt's, at royal cemeteries like El Kuru and Nuri. They worshipped Amun as their chief deity. When they conquered Egypt, they didn't need to learn its culture. They were already its most devoted students. Pia's son, Shabako, consolidated Kushite control and moved the administrative center to Thebes. He demonstrated his commitment to tradition by collecting and preserving ancient religious texts. The famous Shabako stone, now in the British Museum, contained what he claimed was a copy of a worm-eaten papyrus from antiquity, preserving creation myths attributed to the priests of the earliest dynasties. He was positioning himself as a curator of Egypt's deepest traditions. The most celebrated Kushite pharaoh Taharqa ruled during Egypt's brief resurgence as a regional power. His reign was marked by ambitious building projects throughout Egypt and Nubia. At Karnak, he constructed a magnificent colonnade with massive columns topped with papyrus capitals. In Nubia, at sites like Kawa and Jebel Barkal, he built temples rivaling those in Egypt itself. Taharqa's monuments featured distinctive Kushite artistic elements, royal figures with powerfully muscular bodies, broad shoulders, and strong Nubian facial features that departed from the more refined traditional Egyptian royal portraiture. It was a statement the new pharaohs were stronger, more vigorous, the true restorers of a faded glory. Archaeological evidence shows they revitalized Egyptian architecture on a scale not seen since Ramses II. They restored neglected temples, reconstructed damaged monuments, and revived artistic workshops. Their building program wasn't merely aesthetic. It was a powerful political statement about their legitimacy and their role as the true custodians of Egyptian tradition. For a glorious half-century, it seemed the 25th dynasty might actually restore Egypt to its former greatness. This Nubian dynasty's rule, however, was soon challenged by a ruthless military machine whose reputation spread terror across the ancient world, the Assyrian Empire. Under kings Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, the Assyrians were the antithesis of the pious Kushites. They were masters of psychological warfare and brutal conquest. Their army moved with terrifying precision, deploying iron weapons, sophisticated siege engines, and tactics Egyptian forces had never encountered. Assyrian records describe campaigns against Kush and Egypt as if they were a single entity. In 671 BCE, Esarhaddon's forces smashed through the delta, sacked Memphis, and drove to Harka south. The Assyrians were pragmatists of terror. They routinely impaled captives, flayed enemies alive, and created pyramids of severed heads to break resistance before battles even began. When Taharqa temporarily recaptured Memphis, it prompted a massive response from Esarhaddon's successor, Ashurbanipal, who dispatched an army that again drove the Kushite pharaoh southward. Ashurbanipal's inscriptions claim his forces trampled Egypt underfoot, like a bull stands upon grass, illustrating both the violence of the conquest and the Assyrian flair for intimidating propaganda. The ultimate humiliation came in 663 BCE. Ashurbanipal's forces pursued Taharqa's successor, Tantamani, all the way to Thebes. The sacred city, which had stood for millennia as Egypt's religious heart, was subjected to a devastating systematic sack. An Assyrian account coldly records that city, "The whole of it I conquered with the help of Ashur and Ishtar. Silver, gold, precious stones, all the wealth of the palace I removed from it and counted as spoil." The looting of Thebes didn't just remove wealth, it struck at the very foundation of Egyptian spiritual identity. The Kushite dynasty's power in Egypt effectively ended with this catastrophic defeat, forcing them to retreat permanently to their Nubian homeland. In the aftermath, Ashurbanipal installed a local ruler, Nesho-Wine, as a puppet in Sais. Though initially a loyal Assyrian vassal, his lineage would eventually capitalize on Assyria's growing distractions elsewhere to reassert Egyptian independence. Through diplomatic marriages, strategic alliances with Greek mercenaries, and patient political maneuvering, his descendants would gradually reunify Egypt and establish the 26th dynasty, the last significant native Egyptian royal house. The Assyrian period, though brutal, left lasting imprints on Egyptian society. Their bureaucratic practices influenced administration, Egyptian art, incorporated subtle Assyrian influences in royal imagery, and the military was permanently transformed by the incorporation of foreign mercenaries. Yet archaeological evidence from Thebes tells a more nuanced story than the Assyrian accounts of utter destruction. Though damaged, many temples continued functioning. Rebuilding began relatively quickly. The resilience of Egyptian institutions allowed for cultural continuity even after such a traumatic event. However, the psychological impact was profound. No longer could Egyptians believe their land was divinely protected from foreign conquest. The world had broken in, and Egypt would never look at itself the same way again. Part 20. The Last Pharaohs. Greeks, Romans, and the Final Sunset. From the ashes of foreign domination emerged an Egypt determined to reclaim its identity through a fascinating contradiction, embracing innovation while obsessively recreating its ancient past. The ruins of Thebes would give way to something unexpected, a cultural rebirth that borrowed equally from Egypt's golden age and the new international world order. The Sate king's descendants of the Assyrian puppet Necho-Upharne transformed themselves from vassals into Egypt's saviors. After securing control of the Delta region around 664 BCE, they gradually expanded southward ultimately reunifying the fractured nation through diplomacy as much as conquest. The masterstroke came not on the battlefield, but in the quiet halls of the Karnak temple complex. Psamtik-Yi sent his daughter Nitocris to Thebes to be adopted by the powerful divine adoratress of Amun, the highest priestess in the land. This brilliant move merged the northern royal line with southern religious authority, weaving the two lands back together with threads of ritual and bloodline. The 26th dynasty rulers engineered what historians call the Scythe Renaissance, named after their capital at Say. This wasn't merely political restoration, but a deliberate, almost academic cultural revival. Palace artisans became archaeologists, studying thousand-year-old tomb reliefs from the Old Kingdom and copying their styles with remarkable precision. Scribes painstakingly recovered ancient texts and religious formulas. New temple architecture mimicked Old Kingdom proportions and layouts, creating an illusion of timeless continuity, even as the world around Egypt transformed beyond recognition. This cultural nostalgia wasn't merely aesthetic, it was strategic. By positioning themselves as the legitimate heirs to Egypt's golden age, the Sate pharaohs strengthened their claim to rule a nation traumatized by centuries of foreign domination. They created what scholars call a resurrection environment, where temples became time capsules, preserving ancient traditions against an uncertain future. Yet paradoxically, this was also Egypt's most internationally connected era. Greek mercenaries and traders established permanent settlements, especially at Naucratis in the western delta, granted special status by Pharaoh Amasis II around 570 BCE. This first authorized Greek colony became a bustling commercial hub, where Mediterranean merchants exchanged olive oil and wine for Egyptian grain and papyrus. Archaeological excavations have unearthed thousands of Greek pottery fragments alongside Egyptian artifacts, revealing a vibrant cultural exchange that would shape the Mediterranean world. The 26th dynasty's military relied heavily on these foreign soldiers, particularly the fearsome bronze men, as the Egyptians called the Greeks. They received land grants, established families, and gradually integrated into Egyptian society. Some even adopted Egyptian religious practices, dedicating statues and stelae in a fascinating hybrid artistic style that combined Greek proportions with Egyptian iconography. Despite this renaissance, Egypt's geopolitical position remained precarious. When the Neo-Babylonian Empire, under Nebuchadnezzar II, defeated the Assyrians, Egypt briefly expanded its influence into the Levant. Pharaoh Necho II even launched ambitious projects, including an attempt to connect the Nile to the Red Sea with a canal system, a remarkable engineering feat that would only be completed centuries later by the Persians. The emergence of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great dramatically altered the balance of power. Pharaoh Amasis II navigated these dangerous waters with remarkable diplomatic skill, forming alliances with Greek city-states and Lydian king Croesus to counter Persian expansion. His foreign policy kept Egypt prosperous and independent for over 4 decades. But the inevitable confrontation merely awaited his successor. In 525 BCE, Persian king Cambyses II invaded Egypt, defeating Pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium. Egyptian sources claim Cambyses employed psychological warfare, placing cats, sacred animals to Egyptians, in front of his army, knowing Egyptian soldiers would hesitate to fire arrows for fear of harming the revered creatures. While likely exaggerated, this story reflects the cultural clash between Egyptian religious sensibilities and foreign pragmatism. The Persian conquest established the 27th dynasty, the first entirely foreign ruling house. Though Egyptian administration largely continued under Persian oversight, the symbolic wound was profound. Native resistance periodically flared up, with the 28th through 30th dynasties representing brief periods of independence between Persian reconquests. Each restoration became shorter than the last. The final native pharaoh, Nectanebo II, fled to Nubia in 343 BCE as Persian forces retook Egypt for the final time. The collision of empires unfolded dramatically when Alexander the Great swept through the Persian Empire. When he reached Egypt in 332 BCE, many Egyptians welcomed him as a liberator from Persian oppression. The priests at the Siwa Oasis Oracle declared Alexander a son of Amun, granting him divine legitimacy that even the Persians had never fully achieved. After Alexander's death, his general Ptolemy established a dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were masterful cultural chameleons, presenting themselves as legitimate pharaohs to Egyptians while maintaining their Greek identity. They funded massive temple complexes like Edfu and Dendera, where traditional Egyptian religious iconography flourished alongside subtle Greek influences. The dynasty's most shocking practice was their adoption of sibling marriage, previously unthinkable in Greek culture, but familiar in Egyptian royal tradition, which ultimately produced increasingly unstable rulers. Court life in Ptolemaic Alexandria operated with breathtaking brutality, with mothers plotting against sons and brothers assassinating brothers. The dynasty's final act belonged to Cleopatra VII, who masterfully navigated Roman politics through alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Her dramatic suicide in 30 BCE marked not just the end of her reign, but the final collapse of Egypt's 3,000-year civilization as an independent power. When Augustus arrived, he made Egypt his personal imperial province, too valuable to entrust to anyone else. The Roman administration viewed Egypt primarily as a resource to be extracted, its incredible fertility making it the breadbasket of the empire. Roman engineers transformed the landscape with new canals and irrigation systems, while Egyptian farmers bore crushing tax burdens. Throughout early Roman rule, emperors embraced pharaonic imagery while simultaneously dismantling Egyptian independence. Temple walls at Dendera and Philae show Roman emperors performing traditional rituals, their names enclosed in royal cartouches. But the traditional religious landscape gradually shifted as Greek and Latin replaced Egyptian in official contexts. By the late 4th century CE, when Emperor Theodosius banned pagan worship, many temples had already fallen into disuse. The Temple of Isis at Philae stood as the last functioning Egyptian temple until 537 CE, when Justinian finally ordered its closure. Egypt's story is ultimately one of resilience. For 3,000 years, it adapted, absorbing invaders, mastering new tools, and blending cultures while staying uniquely Egyptian. Its secret wasn't stubborn resistance to change, but the opposite, adapting without losing its essential identity. The last rays of the sun, God Ra, finally set on the pharaohs, but the civilization they built continues to captivate the world, reminding us that eternity is measured not in stone, but in the enduring power of culture and memory.